Chapter 1. The Routine Scan. Harry Potter stood outside the oak doors of the hospital wing, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in a nervous rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. The oversized trainers Aunt Petunia had grudgingly purchased from the church jumble sale squeaked against the stone floor with each movement, the sound echoing in the corridor like a confession he wasn't ready to make. Dudley's hand-me-down robes hung loose around his shoulders, the fabric so voluminous it made him look even smaller than his 11 years suggested. The sleeves had been rolled up 4 times and still threatened to swallow his hands completely. He could have been anywhere else in the castle right now. The great hall, where first years were probably still marveling at the floating candles and the ceiling that showed the sky. The common room, where he might have learned the password and found a chair by the fire. Even wandering the corridors would have been preferable to this. But Professor McGonagall had been quite clear during the welcome speech that all first-year students were required to complete a basic health assessment before attending their first classes. "Standard procedure," she'd said in her crisp Scottish accent, though her eyes had lingered on Harry for a moment longer than strictly necessary. The door opened with a soft creak, and a woman appeared in the doorway. Harry recognized her immediately from the brief introductions during the feast. Madame Pomfrey, the school's matron. She was smaller than he'd expected, with greying hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her white apron was spotless, starched to perfection, and when she smiled at him, Harry felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. "Mr. Potter, I presume?" she said, and her voice carried the same no-nonsense tone as Aunt Petunia's when she was discussing the weekly grocery list, but without the underlying irritation that always seemed to simmer beneath his aunt's words. Come in. This won't take long." Harry stepped into the hospital wing, and the first thing that struck him was the smell. Not the harsh antiseptic of the clinic where Aunt Petunia had taken him exactly once, when Dudley had accidentally given him a black eye that was too obvious to explain away. This smelled of herbs and something faintly medicinal but pleasant, like the way Hagrid's hut had smelled of chamomile and wood smoke. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting patterns on the polished floor, and the beds were made up with crisp white linens that looked impossibly soft. "Nothing to worry about," Madame Pomfrey said briskly, gesturing toward a chair beside what appeared to be her desk. "Just a standard magical health assessment. We do this for all new students to ensure you're in good health and to create a baseline for future medical needs." Quite routine, really. Harry nodded and sat down, his feet not quite reaching the floor. The chair was comfortable, more comfortable than anything in the Dursley house, and he found himself relaxing despite his nervousness. Madame Pomfrey bustled around her desk, gathering what looked like medical instruments, though they bore little resemblance to anything Harry had ever seen before. One appeared to be a crystal sphere that glowed faintly when she picked it up. Another looked like a thermometer, if thermometers were made of silver, and hummed quietly when touched. "Now then," she said, pulling a second chair closer and sitting down across from him. "First things first. How are you feeling today? Any aches, pains, discomfort? Headaches? Difficulty sleeping?" The questions were delivered with such matter-of-fact kindness that Harry found himself answering honestly. "I'm fine," he said, which was the truth as far as he understood it. He felt the same as he always did, a bit tired, a bit hungry, but nothing that seemed worth mentioning. The persistent ache in his lower back from sleeping on the thin mattress in his cupboard had faded since arriving at Hogwarts, and the constant knot of anxiety in his stomach had loosened considerably since leaving Privet Drive. "Excellent," Madame Pomfrey said, making a note on a piece of parchment. "Now, I'm going to run a few diagnostic spells. Nothing invasive, just some general health magic to make sure everything's functioning as it should. You might feel a slight tingling sensation, but nothing uncomfortable." She raised her wand, a sturdy-looking thing made of what appeared to be applewood, and Harry tensed automatically. In his experience, when adults did things with authority and confidence, it rarely ended well for him. But Madame Pomfrey's expression remained kind, and professional as she began to murmur incantations under her breath. The first spell felt exactly as she'd described, a gentle tingling that started at the top of his head and worked its way down to his toes. It was rather like being touched by warm sunshine, if sunshine could somehow reach inside and check that everything was working properly. Harry found himself relaxing again, his hands unclenching from where they'd gripped the sides of his chair. The second spell felt different. The tingling intensified, became more focused, and Harry could see a faint golden glow emanating from Madame Pomfrey's wand. She was concentrating now, her brow furrowed slightly, as she moved the wand in a complex pattern above his head and down toward his torso. Then she stopped. The wand froze in midair, and Harry saw her eyes widen behind her glasses. The colour seemed to drain from her face all at once, leaving her looking pale and shaken. She stared at the tip of her wand, where tiny symbols were appearing and disappearing in rapid succession, glowing with an urgent red light that seemed somehow ominous. "I beg your pardon," she said, her voice suddenly tight. "Let me try that again." This time the spell lasted longer. Much longer. Madame Pomfrey's wand moved in increasingly complex patterns, and Harry could see her lips moving as she cast what sounded like half a dozen different diagnostic charms. The golden glow grew brighter, and more symbols appeared. Not just red now, but orange and yellow, and a particularly alarming shade of purple that made Harry's stomach clench with a familiar dread. When she finally lowered her wand, Madame Pomfrey's hands were shaking. "Mr. Potter," she said carefully, as if each word had to be selected from a very small and precious supply. "I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly. Can you do that for me?" Harry nodded, though his throat felt suddenly dry. Adults only used that tone when something was very, very wrong, and he was probably going to be blamed for it. "Have you ever broken any bones?" she asked. "Your arms, your legs, your ribs?" The question was so unexpected that Harry blinked. "I don't think so," he said slowly. "I mean, nothing that needed a doctor or anything." Madame Pomfrey made another note, her handwriting sharp and decisive. "Have you ever been seriously injured? Falls? Accidents? Anything that might have caused significant trauma?" "Not really," Harry said, which was the truth as he understood it. He'd fallen off his bicycle once when he was 7, and skinned his knees badly enough that Aunt Petunia had been forced to clean the wounds and apply plasters, but that hardly seemed serious enough to mention. There had been the time Dudley had pushed him down the stairs, but he'd only ended up with some bruises and a sore shoulder. Uncle Vernon's punishments could be painful, but they were hardly injuries in any meaningful sense. "What about illness?" Madame Pomfrey pressed. "Frequent colds, infections, any ongoing health problems?" "I get sick sometimes," Harry said. "But everyone does, don't they?" She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she stood and walked to a cabinet on the far side of the room, returning with what looked like a more sophisticated version of the diagnostic instruments she'd been using. This one was larger, more complex, with multiple crystals embedded in a metal framework that hummed with barely contained magical energy. "Mr. Potter," she said, setting the device on her desk, "I'm going to need to run some more comprehensive scans. I want to assure you that you're not in any trouble, and nothing I find here will leave this room without your permission. But I'm seeing some things that concern me. Do you understand?" Harry nodded again, though he didn't understand at all. The familiar weight of impending disaster was settling in his chest like a cold stone. Whatever the magic was showing her, whatever she was seeing, it was his fault somehow. It always was. The advanced diagnostic spell was unlike anything Harry had ever experienced. Instead of the gentle tingling of the previous charms, this felt like being thoroughly examined from the inside out. He could sense the magic moving through his body, cataloguing and measuring and recording with methodical precision. It didn't hurt exactly, but it was intensely personal in a way that made him want to squirm in his chair. Madame Pomfrey watched the readouts with growing alarm. The crystals in her device were glowing now, different colours for different findings, and Harry could see her face cycling through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a kind of cold, professional fury that was somehow more frightening than Uncle Vernon's red-faced shouting had ever been. When the scanning was complete, she sat back in her chair and stared at him for a long moment. Harry fidgeted under her gaze, trying to figure out what he'd done wrong and how he might apologize for it. "Harry," she said finally, and the use of his first name was somehow more ominous than any formal address might have been. "How long have you lived with your aunt and uncle?" "Since I was a baby," he said. "Since my parents died." "And how would you describe your relationship with them?" The question was clearly loaded with some kind of adult significance that Harry couldn't pass. "It's fine," he said automatically. "I mean, they're not really... We don't really... It's fine. Do they feed you regularly? 3 meals a day?" "Most days," Harry said, which was technically true. He got breakfast when there were no chores that needed doing first, lunch when he wasn't being punished for some infraction, and dinner when he'd completed his household tasks to Aunt Petunia's satisfaction. That was most days, wasn't it? "And where do you sleep?" "In my room," Harry said, then caught himself. "I mean, in the cupboard under the stairs. But it's my room," he added quickly, not wanting her to think he was complaining. "I mean, they gave it to me specially." Something in Madame Pomfrey's expression shifted. The professional concern was still there, but now it was underscored with something that looked like barely contained rage. She stood abruptly and walked to her desk, where she pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and began writing with rapid, decisive strokes. "Harry," she said without looking up, "I need you to wait here for a few minutes. I'm going to ask Professor McGonagall to join us. There are some things we need to discuss, and I think it would be helpful to have her here." "Am I in trouble?" Harry asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Madame Pomfrey looked up from her writing, and her expression softened immediately. "Oh, my dear boy," she said, and there was something in her voice that Harry had never heard from an adult before, something that might have been compassion. "You're not in trouble, not even a little bit. But there are some things about your health that we need to address, and Professor McGonagall will want to hear about them." She finished her note and sealed it with a dab of wax, then walked to the window and opened it. A barn owl was perched on the sill almost immediately, as if it had been waiting for the summons. She attached the letter to its leg and spoke to it in the kind of urgent whisper that made Harry's stomach clench with anxiety. While they waited for McGonagall to arrive, Madame Pomfrey busied herself with organizing her medical supplies, but Harry could see that her hands were still trembling slightly. Whatever the diagnostic spells had shown her, it was clearly worse than a simple case of first-year nerves or homesickness. The door to the hospital wing opened with more force than was strictly necessary, and Professor McGonagall strode in with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested she'd run up 3 flights of stairs without pausing to catch her breath. Her robes billowed behind her like dark wings, and her expression was sharp with concern. "Poppy," she said without preamble, "what's happened?" "Minerva, thank you for coming so quickly." Madame Pomfrey gestured toward Harry, who was beginning to feel like an exhibit in some kind of medical museum. "I've just completed Mr. Potter's health assessment, and I'm afraid we have a situation." McGonagall's eyes flicked to Harry, and he saw her expression soften slightly. "Are you all right, Potter?" "I think so," Harry said uncertainly. "I mean, I feel fine." "The problem," Madame Pomfrey said quietly, "is that he shouldn't." She moved to her desk and picked up the diagnostic results, holding them so that only McGonagall could see the details. Harry watched as his head of house read through the findings, her expression growing progressively more grim with each line. "Poppy," McGonagall said finally, her voice carefully controlled, "are you certain these results are accurate?" "I've run the diagnostics 3 times, Madame Pomfrey replied. "Different spells, different instruments. The results are consistent across all methodologies." McGonagall lowered the parchment and looked at Harry with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. There was anger there, but not at him. It seemed to be directed at some invisible target behind his shoulder. There was also something that might have been pity, which made him squirm uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Potter," McGonagall said carefully, "Madame Pomfrey's scans have revealed some concerning information about your medical history. She's found evidence of multiple healed fractures, broken bones that have mended without proper magical or medical treatment." Harry stared at her blankly. "But I've never broken any bones," he said. "According to the diagnostic evidence," Madame Pomfrey said gently, "you've broken quite a few. Your left arm, at least twice. Several ribs on your right side. Your collarbone. 2 fingers on your right hand. All of these injuries show signs of having healed naturally, without any kind of medical intervention." "That's impossible," Harry said automatically. "I would remember breaking bones. That would hurt a lot, wouldn't it?" The look that passed between the two women was loaded with meaning that Harry couldn't decipher. McGonagall sat down in the chair that Madame Pomfrey had vacated, bringing herself to Harry's eye level. "Harry," she said, and the use of his first name felt significant in a way he couldn't quite pinpoint. Sometimes when people are hurt very badly, or very frequently, they learn not to think of the pain as unusual. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" He didn't. Or rather, he did, but he couldn't make the connection she seemed to be implying. The times Uncle Vernon had gotten really angry enough to shove Harry hard enough to send him sprawling, or to grab his arm tight enough to leave bruises. Those had hurt, certainly. But broken bones. Surely he would have noticed if he'd actually broken bones. "I don't remember being hurt that badly," he said finally. "What do you remember?" Madame Pomfrey asked. "About times when you were injured or in pain?" Harry thought about it. There had been the incident with the stairs when he was 6, when Uncle Vernon had pushed him hard enough that he'd tumbled down the entire flight and landed in a heap at the bottom. He'd been sore for weeks afterward, and his left arm had ached constantly, but he'd assumed that was normal. There had been the time when he was 8, and Dudley's gang had cornered him in the park, and one of them had kicked him so hard in the ribs that he'd had trouble breathing for days. The morning when he was 7, and Uncle Vernon had grabbed his arm to drag him to his cupboard, and Harry had heard something make a soft, popping sound, after which his arm had been too painful to use properly for more than a month. But those were just normal things, weren't they? The kind of minor injuries that happened to everyone. As he related these incidents to the two women, their expressions grew progressively more alarmed. Madame Pomfrey was taking notes again, and McGonagall's hands were clenched in her lap hard enough that her knuckles had gone white. "Harry," McGonagall said when he'd finished, and her voice was very carefully neutral, "when these things happened to you, did your aunt and uncle take you to see a doctor?" "No," Harry said, confused by the question. "Why would they? I wasn't really hurt." "When you couldn't use your arm for a month," Madame Pomfrey said carefully, "did anyone help you with daily tasks? Dressing, washing, eating?" "I managed," Harry said, which was true. It had been difficult, especially since the injury hadn't exempted him from his regular chores, but he'd worked out ways to do everything one-handed. Aunt Petunia had been annoyed by how long it took him to complete his tasks, but she'd never actually asked what was wrong. "The scans also show signs of chronic malnutrition," Madame Pomfrey continued, consulting her notes. "Not severe enough to be life-threatening, but significant. Extended periods of insufficient caloric intake, particularly during your developmental years. And there's evidence of magical suppression, deliberate attempts to prevent your magical abilities from manifesting naturally." This was even more confusing than the broken bones. "What does that mean?" "It means," McGonagall said, and Harry could hear the barely contained fury in her voice, "that someone has been systematically starving you and trying to prevent you from accessing your magical heritage." "But that's—" Harry started, then stopped. He'd been about to say that it was impossible, But looking at the evidence spread out on Madame Pomfrey's desk, at the serious expressions on both women's faces, he wasn't sure what was possible anymore. The hunger was something he'd never really thought about. There had always been restrictions on when and what he could eat. Breakfast only after his chores were done, no snacks between meals, smaller portions than what Dudley received. But that was just how things were in the Dursley household. Harry had assumed it was normal, or at least that it was normal for him. And the magic? Well, he'd always known there was something different about him. The strange things that happened when he was frightened or angry. The way his hair grew back overnight after Aunt Petunia cut it. The time he'd somehow ended up on the school roof when Dudley's gang was chasing him. But Uncle Vernon's rages, whenever anything unusual happened, had taught Harry to suppress those incidents, to push them down and pretend they'd never occurred. "The good news," Madame Pomfrey said, apparently sensing his growing distress, "is that all of these issues are treatable. The malnutrition can be addressed with proper nutrition and some supplemental potions. The magical suppression will resolve itself now that you're in a magical environment. And while the healed fractures can't be undone, I can ensure that they won't cause you problems in the future." "But first," McGonagall said, standing up with the decisive movement of someone who had reached an important conclusion, "we need to make some arrangements." She turned to Madame Pomfrey. "How long will the treatment take?" "Several weeks for the nutrition issues," Madame Pomfrey replied. "Longer for him to reach his proper height and weight for his age. The magical suppression should resolve quickly now that he's at Hogwarts, but I'll want to monitor him closely." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," Madame Pomfrey said firmly, "he stays here. I'm not comfortable with him leaving the hospital wing until I'm satisfied with his physical condition, and frankly, I think he needs some time to process all of this information." Harry looked between the two women, trying to understand the implications of what they were saying. "Does this mean I can't attend classes?" "Your classes are the least of our concerns right now," McGonagall said, but not unkindly. "We'll arrange for you to catch up on any coursework you miss. Right now, the priority is making sure you're healthy and safe." Safe. It was such a simple word, but hearing it applied to him felt strange and foreign. Harry couldn't remember the last time an adult had been concerned about his safety, couldn't remember ever being in a place where his well-being was considered a priority. "What happens next?" he asked. McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey exchanged another one of those loaded glances. "Next," McGonagall said, "we make sure this never happens again." The conviction in her voice was absolute, and for the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, Harry allowed himself to believe that maybe, possibly, things might actually be different here. Maybe, in this place, where magic was real and adults seemed to care about whether children were hurt, he might finally be safe. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the hospital wing, casting everything in warm golden light. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was exactly where he was supposed to be, surrounded by adults whose only concern was his well-being. It was a feeling so foreign that he didn't quite know what to do with it. But as he settled into the comfortable chair beside Madame Pomfrey's desk, listening to the quiet conversation between his head of house and the school matron as they discussed treatment plans and protective measures, Harry thought he might be willing to learn. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. The owl that carried McGonagall's urgent summons found Albus Dumbledore in his office, contemplating the latest correspondence from the Ministry regarding the upcoming term's curriculum requirements. The letter was brief, written in McGonagall's characteristically precise script, but the words seemed to burn themselves into the parchment with their intensity. Emergency faculty meeting required immediately. Matter concerns Harry Potter's welfare. Most urgent. Dumbledore set down his teacup with deliberate care, though something in his chest had begun to flutter like a trapped bird. In all his years as headmaster, Minerva McGonagall had never used the word emergency lightly, and the combination of urgency and Harry Potter's name in the same sentence was enough to send his mind racing through a dozen different possibilities, none of them pleasant. He activated the communication system that connected all senior faculty members, his voice carrying through the castle's ancient stones with magical amplification. All heads of house and senior staff to my office immediately. Priority Alpha. Within minutes, the circular office had filled with the rustle of robes and the quiet murmur of concerned voices. Professor Flitwick had arrived first, his small stature belied by the sharp intelligence in his eyes as he took in Dumbledore's unusually grave expression. Professor Sprout followed close behind, still brushing soil from her hands after abandoning her work in the greenhouses. Snape entered last, his black robes billowing like storm clouds, his expression already set in lines of professional skepticism. McGonagall stood near the window, her back straight and her hands clasped behind her as she gazed out at the grounds where first-year students should have been enjoying their first afternoon of freedom at Hogwarts. When she turned to face the assembled faculty, Dumbledore was struck by the controlled fury in her expression, a cold, precise anger that was somehow more alarming than any outburst might have been. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice clipped and professional. "We have a situation that requires immediate attention and collective decision-making. It concerns Harry Potter." "What's the boy done now?" Snape asked, his tone suggesting he already expected the worst. "Surely he hasn't managed to get into serious trouble before even attending his first class." The look McGonagall fixed on him could have withered a mandrake in full bloom. "Harry Potter hasn't done anything, Severus. The problem is what has been done to him." She moved to the center of the room, commanding attention, with the kind of presence that had made her one of Hogwarts's most respected professors. "This afternoon, Madame Pomfrey conducted a routine health assessment on Mr. Potter as part of our standard first-year procedures. What she discovered—" McGonagall paused, and Dumbledore could see her struggling to maintain her composure. What she discovered was evidence of systematic physical abuse spanning multiple years. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Professor Flitwick made a small, wounded sound, while Professor Sprout's hands flew to cover her mouth. Snape's expression remained carefully blank, but Dumbledore could see the muscle in his jaw twitching with suppressed emotion. "Define evidence," Dumbledore said quietly, and even to his own ears, his voice sounded strained. "Multiple healed fractures consistent with deliberate violence," McGonagall replied, consulting the parchment she held in her hands. "Chronic malnutrition, resulting in stunted growth and developmental delays. Signs of magical suppression that could only have been achieved through sustained psychological and physical trauma." She looked up from her notes, her green eyes blazing. "Shall I continue, Albus? Or is that sufficient to establish the severity of the situation?" Dumbledore felt something cold and heavy settling in his stomach. He had known, of course, had always known that the Dursleys were not ideal guardians for Harry, but he had convinced himself that the protection offered by Lily's sacrifice, the blood wards that would keep Harry safe from Voldemort and his followers, outweighed any domestic unpleasantness. He had told himself that a little hardship would build character, would keep Harry from developing the arrogance that had so marked his father. "Where is the boy now?" he asked. "In the hospital wing, under Madame Pomfrey's care," McGonagall replied, "where he will remain until we determine the appropriate course of action." "Appropriate course of action?" Snape's voice was carefully controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something dangerous in his tone. Surely the appropriate course of action is to contact the relevant authorities and ensure that those responsible face the consequences of their actions. Professor Flitwick nodded emphatically. "The Department of Magical Law Enforcement should be notified immediately. This is a matter for the Wizengamot, not internal school policy." "I agree," Professor Sprout said, her usually gentle voice firm with conviction. "That poor child has suffered enough. He deserves justice, and more importantly, he deserves to know that the adults in his life will protect him going forward." Dumbledore raised a hand, calling for calm. Before we make any hasty decisions, we must consider all aspects of this situation. Harry's safety and well-being are, of course, our primary concern, but we must also think about the broader implications. Broader implications? McGonagall's voice had risen to a pitch that made several portraits along the walls stir uneasily. Albus, a child has been systematically abused for a decade, and your first concern is broader implications. You placed him there, Snape said suddenly, his black eyes fixed on Dumbledore with laser intensity. You personally made the decision to leave Potter with his Muggle relatives. On what basis did you make that choice? The question hung in the air like a physical thing, and Dumbledore could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. He had hoped to avoid this particular line of inquiry, at least until he had time to prepare a more thorough explanation. The placement was made for reasons of magical security, he said carefully. Harry's mother's sacrifice created powerful protective magic that could only be sustained while he lived with her blood relatives. It was a difficult decision, but one that ensured his safety from those who would do him harm. Safety from whom, exactly? McGonagall demanded. Because it appears that the greatest threat to Harry Potter's well-being has been living under the same roof for the past 10 years. Snape was very still, his pale hands folded in front of him, but his voice carried a deadly quiet that made everyone in the room unconsciously lean away. Did you conduct any sort of assessment of these relatives before placing an infant in their care? Any inquiry into their character, their fitness as guardians? I was familiar with their temperament, Dumbledore admitted reluctantly. But I believed that love for their nephew would overcome any initial reluctance. Love? The word came out like a curse, and Snape's composure finally cracked enough to show the fury burning beneath. You believed that people who had spent years despising Lily Evans for her magical abilities would suddenly develop parental affection for her magical son? Severus. Did you monitor the situation? Professor Flitwick asked, his voice higher than usual with agitation. Surely you maintained some oversight to ensure the child's welfare? There were periodic observations, Dumbledore said, feeling increasingly cornered. Mrs. Figg was asked to provide occasional reports. Mrs. Figg knew, McGonagall said, and it wasn't a question. She knew what was happening to Harry and said nothing. Her instructions were to maintain a low profile and avoid drawing attention to Harry's presence in the neighborhood, Dumbledore explained. She was told that a certain amount of difficulty with his relatives was to be expected, and that intervention should only occur in cases of genuine danger. Genuine danger? Professor Sprout's voice was shaking now. What exactly constitutes genuine danger in your estimation, Albus? Because broken bones and malnutrition seem fairly genuine to the rest of us. The accusations were coming faster now, and Dumbledore could feel his carefully constructed justifications beginning to crumble under the weight of his colleagues' moral outrage. He had spent so many years telling himself that his decisions were necessary, that the greater good required certain sacrifices. But faced with the immediate, tangible evidence of Harry's suffering, those philosophical justifications felt hollow and self-serving. Meanwhile, 3 floors below in the hospital wing, Harry Potter sat in a comfortable chair beside a window, trying to make sense of the conversation he'd overheard earlier. Madame Pomfrey had stepped out briefly to collect some potions from her private stores, and in the quiet of the empty ward, Harry had found his mind circling back to the words the adults had used. Systematic abuse, malnutrition, magical suppression. The concepts felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else's life. He had always assumed that his experiences with the Dursleys were normal, or at least normal for him. The idea that adults could be horrified by what he had simply accepted as the way things were was difficult to process. A soft knock at the door interrupted his brooding, and Hagrid's enormous form appeared in the doorway. The groundskeeper's face was unusually pale, and his beetle-black eyes were rimmed with red as if he'd been crying. "Harry," Hagrid said, his voice rougher than usual. Professor McGonagall sent word. Blimey, I don't even know what to say." Harry looked up at the half-giant who had changed his life by telling him he was a wizard, and felt a familiar stab of guilt. "I'm sorry," he said automatically. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "Sorry?" Hagrid's voice cracked on the word. "Harry, you've got nothing to be sorry for. Nothing at all." He moved further into the room, his massive hands twisting the hem of his coat in a gesture of overwhelming distress. "I'm the one who should be apologizing. I'm the one who took you to those people in the first place." This was a new piece of information, and Harry turned it over in his mind carefully. "You took me to the Dursleys?" "Dumbledore's orders," Hagrid said miserably. "Night your parents died, he told me to collect you from the wreckage and bring you to Privet Drive. Said it was the safest place for you. Said you'd be loved and cared for." His voice broke completely. "If I'd known, if I'd had any idea what they were really like." "You couldn't have known," Harry said, though he wasn't entirely sure why he was comforting Hagrid instead of the other way around. "I should have checked," Hagrid insisted. "Should have visited, should have made sure you were all right. Instead, I believed what Dumbledore told me and never looked back. 10 years, Harry. 10 years I left you with those monsters." The word monsters applied to the Dursleys felt strange and unsettling. They were certainly unpleasant, but monsters seemed like such a strong term for people who were simply the way they were. "They're not monsters," Harry said quietly. "They just don't like magic. Or me, really. But that's not the same thing." Hagrid stared at him with an expression of such profound heartbreak that Harry felt compelled to look away. "Oh, Harry," the groundskeeper whispered. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it? You've lived with it so long you think it's normal." Before Harry could formulate a response to that, Madame Pomfrey returned with an armload of bottles and vials. She took one look at Hagrid's distraught expression and Harry's confusion, and immediately set her supplies aside. "Hagrid," she said gently, "perhaps this conversation would be better continued another time. Harry needs rest, and frankly, so do you." "I just needed him to know," Hagrid said, wiping his eyes with the back of his enormous hand. "Needed him to know that if I'd understood, if I'd realized—" "He knows," Madame Pomfrey assured him. "And Harry, you should know that everyone who cares about you is working to make sure you're safe and protected going forward. That's what adults are supposed to do for children, and it's what we should have been doing all along." After Hagrid left, promising to return the next day with some of Harry's favorite rock cakes, Madame Pomfrey busied herself with organizing her newly acquired potions. Harry watched her efficient movements and tried to process everything he'd learned in the past few hours. "Madame Pomfrey," he said finally, "what happens now?" She paused in her work and turned to give him her full attention. "Now, Harry, the adults who care about you are going to have some very serious discussions about how to best ensure your safety and well-being. There will likely be formal investigations, legal proceedings, and a great deal of bureaucracy that you don't need to worry about." "But what about me?" Harry pressed. "Where will I live? What will happen to the Dursleys?" "Those are excellent questions," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "And I wish I had definitive answers for you. What I can tell you is that you will never be forced to return to a situation where you're being hurt. That much is absolutely certain." The certainty in her voice was comforting, but Harry found himself struggling with a concept that felt almost too large to comprehend. A future where his safety and comfort were actually priorities for the adults around him. Back in Dumbledore's office, the emergency faculty meeting had devolved into something approaching open warfare. McGonagall and Snape had found themselves on the same side for perhaps the first time in their professional relationship, united in their condemnation of Dumbledore's decisions regarding Harry's placement. "The question now," Professor Flitwick said, attempting to restore some semblance of order to the proceedings, "is what we do going forward. Clearly the boy cannot return to his relatives." "Agreed," Professor Sprout said firmly. "But we need to think carefully about alternative arrangements. Harry has spent his entire life in an abusive environment. He's going to need specialized care, both medical and psychological. The hospital wing can provide the medical support, McGonagall said, and I'm prepared to take personal responsibility for his general welfare until more permanent arrangements can be made. Snape raised an eyebrow. You're volunteering to become the boy's guardian? If necessary, McGonagall replied without hesitation. Harry Potter deserves to have at least one adult in his life who puts his well-being before political considerations. The pointed nature of that comment was not lost on anyone in the room, and Dumbledore felt the weight of accumulated guilt settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He had spent so many years convincing himself that his grand strategy justified the smaller sacrifices, that the ultimate defeat of Voldemort was worth any amount of personal suffering on Harry's part. But looking at his colleagues' faces, seeing the moral clarity of their outrage, Dumbledore was forced to confront the possibility that he had simply become very good at justifying the unjustifiable. There will be an investigation, he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. The Ministry will need to be contacted, and there will likely be formal charges brought against the Dursley family. And against anyone else who knew about the situation and failed to intervene, McGonagall added pointedly. Dumbledore nodded slowly. Yes, I suspect there will be consequences for all of us who failed in our duty to protect Harry. The meeting continued for another hour, but the essential decisions had been made. Harry would remain in the hospital wing under Madame Pomfrey's care, with McGonagall serving as his temporary guardian. The Ministry would be contacted in the morning, and formal investigations would begin immediately. As his colleagues filed out of the office, each wearing expressions of grim determination, Dumbledore found himself alone with the weight of his choices. For decades, he had been regarded as the wisest wizard of his generation, the moral compass for magical Britain. But tonight, faced with the evidence of Harry Potter's suffering and the righteous anger of his peers, Albus Dumbledore felt old and foolish and profoundly ashamed. In the hospital wing, Harry had fallen asleep in his chair, exhausted by the emotional upheaval of the day. Madame Pomfrey covered him with a soft blanket and dimmed the lights, then settled at her desk to begin documenting everything she would need for the inevitable legal proceedings. Outside the castle windows, the sun was setting over the grounds of Hogwarts, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was sleeping safely under the protection of adults who valued his well-being above all other considerations. It was a small beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. The investigation that would reshape the wizarding world's understanding of child protection was about to begin. And at its center was an 11-year-old boy who was finally learning what it meant to be truly safe. Tomorrow would bring ministry officials and formal inquiries, and the beginning of a process that would hold everyone accountable for their failures. But tonight, Harry Potter slept peacefully in the hospital wing, surrounded by the kind of care he had never known existed. And in offices and quarters throughout the castle, the adults responsible for his well-being worked late into the night, planning a future where no child would ever again suffer as Harry had suffered. It was the least they could do, and the most important work any of them had ever undertaken. Chapter 3. The Ministry Intervention. The morning light filtering through the hospital wing windows found Harry Potter awake before dawn, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the fragments of adult conversations that had drifted through his dreams. He had slept better than he could remember sleeping in years. The bed was comfortable beyond anything he'd experienced, and there had been no anxious listening for the sound of Uncle Vernon's heavy footsteps on the stairs above his cupboard. But his mind had been active all night, processing the implications of words like investigation and justice that seemed to apply, impossibly, to his own life. Madame Pomfrey appeared at his bedside with the quiet efficiency that seemed to characterize all her movements, carrying a breakfast tray that made Harry's eyes widen. There were eggs, actual eggs, not the burnt scraps he occasionally received at Privet Drive, along with bacon, toast with real butter, and a glass of what appeared to be fresh pumpkin juice. "Good morning, Harry," she said, setting the tray on the bedside table with careful precision. "I trust you slept well?" "Yes, thank you," Harry replied automatically, though his attention was fixed on the food. It smelled wonderful, and there was so much of it. Surely this wasn't all for him. "Go on," Madame Pomfrey said gently, noticing his hesitation. "It's all yours, and there's plenty more where that came from." Harry began eating slowly, savouring each bite in a way that would have earned him sharp words about gratitude from Aunt Petunia. The bacon was crispy without being burned, the eggs were perfectly cooked, and the toast was golden brown and warm. It was the kind of breakfast he'd sometimes seen Dudley eat while he received a single piece of dry bread and was told to be grateful for it. "Madame Pomfrey," he said between careful bites, "what's going to happen today?" She pulled up a chair and sat down beside his bed, her expression serious but kind. "Today, Harry, some people from the Ministry of Magic are going to come and talk to you. They're going to ask you questions about your life with your aunt and uncle, and they're going to write down what you tell them so that they can help decide what should happen next." The word ministry carried weight that Harry could sense, even if he didn't fully understand it. "Are they going to be angry with me?" "Oh, my dear boy," Madame Pomfrey said, and there was something in her voice that reminded Harry of the way McGonagall had spoken to him the day before, a kind of fierce protectiveness that he'd never associated with adult attention. "They're not angry with you. They're angry about what happened to you. There's a very big difference." Before Harry could ask what that difference might be, the door to the hospital wing opened, and Professor McGonagall entered, followed by a tall black man in dark robes who carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that made Harry instinctively straighten in his bed. "Harry," McGonagall said, approaching with the same careful concern she'd shown the previous day, "I'd like you to meet Aura Kingsley Shacklebolt from the Ministry's Department of Magical Law Enforcement. He's here to talk with you about your experiences with the Dursleys." Kingsley Shacklebolt had the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and calm, and seemed to carry an implicit promise that he could be trusted with difficult truths. "Hello, Harry," he said, extending a large hand for Harry to shake. "I want you to know from the start that you're not in any kind of trouble. I'm here because some very serious adults are very concerned about your welfare, and we want to make sure we understand exactly what's been happening in your life." Harry shook the offered hand, surprised by the firm but gentle grip. "Are you a policeman?" "Something like that," Kingsley said with a slight smile. "In the magical world, auras are responsible for investigating serious crimes and protecting people who can't protect themselves. Right now, that includes you." McGonagall conjured a comfortable chair for Kingsley and positioned it at an angle that allowed him to speak with Harry without looming over the bed. She remained standing nearby, and Harry found her presence reassuring in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "Before we begin," Kingsley said, pulling out a long quill and a roll of parchment, "I want to explain exactly what's going to happen. I'm going to ask you questions about your life with the Dursleys, and I'm going to write down your answers. Everything you tell me will be kept confidential unless you give permission for it to be shared, and you can stop talking at any time if you need a break." He paused, studying Harry's face with the kind of attention that suggested he was looking for signs of distress or discomfort. "The most important thing I want you to understand is that whatever you tell me, I will believe you. Adults should have been listening to you all along, and I'm here to make sure that happens now." Harry felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen at those words. The idea that an adult would simply believe what he said, without questioning or dismissing or explaining away his experiences, was so foreign that he wasn't quite sure how to respond to it. "Can I ask you something first?" Harry said. "Of course. What's going to happen to my aunt and uncle?" Kingsley exchanged a glance with McGonagall before answering. That will depend on what we learn during this investigation, Harry. But I can tell you that if we find evidence that they've hurt you or failed in their duty to care for you properly, there will be consequences. Will I have to see them again? Not if you don't want to, McGonagall said firmly. That much I can promise you. The certainty in her voice was like a weight lifting from Harry's shoulders. The idea that he might never again have to face Uncle Vernon's purple rage or Aunt Petunia's cold disapproval was so overwhelming that he felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Kingsley began with simple questions: Harry's full name, his birth date, how long he'd lived with the Dursleys. Then he moved on to more complex territory, asking about daily routines, living arrangements, and the general atmosphere in the Dursley household. Harry answered as honestly as he could, though he found himself struggling to articulate things that had simply been the fabric of his existence for so long. "Tell me about your room," Kingsley said, making notes as Harry spoke. "My cupboard," Harry corrected automatically, then caught himself. "I mean, it used to be a cupboard, under the stairs. But when I got my Hogwarts letter, Uncle Vernon moved me to Dudley's second bedroom." "You lived in a cupboard under the stairs." Kingsley's voice remained carefully neutral, but Harry could see his grip tighten on his quill. "It wasn't that bad," Harry said quickly, sensing disapproval and instinctively trying to deflect it. "I mean, it was small, but it was private. And it had a light." "How small, Harry?" Harry tried to think of a way to describe the space that wouldn't sound as cramped as it actually was. "Well, I could lie down if I curled up a bit, and there was room for a mattress and some shelves for my things." "What things did you have?" This was harder to answer than it should have been. Harry's possessions had been few and carefully hidden from Dudley's destructive impulses. Some books from school, a few clothes that were too small for Dudley, a broken watch I found in the garden once. Kingsley made more notes, and Harry could see McGonagall's hands clenching and unclenching at her sides as she listened. "Let's talk about meals," Kingsley said. "What would a typical day of eating look like for you?" Harry found this question difficult to answer, because there hadn't really been such a thing as a typical day. His access to food had depended entirely on his standing with the Dursleys at any given moment, which in turn had depended on factors largely beyond his control. "It varied," he said finally. "If I hadn't done anything wrong, I'd get breakfast after I finished my morning chores. Usually toast, sometimes with a bit of jam, if Aunt Petunia was in a good mood." "What kind of chores would you do in the morning?" "Making breakfast for Uncle Vernon and Dudley, making sure Dudley's school things were ready, sometimes weeding the garden if the weather was good." Harry paused, trying to remember other tasks that had been expected of him. "Cleaning the kitchen, usually, making sure the newspaper was folded properly for Uncle Vernon." "And lunch?" "Sometimes," Harry said. "If I was home from school, and I'd finished the things Aunt Petunia wanted me to do. Usually a sandwich, or leftovers from whatever Dudley didn't finish." "And dinner?" "Most nights, unless—" Harry trailed off, not sure how to explain the complex calculus of punishment and reward that had governed his access to evening meals. "Unless what, Harry?" Kingsley prompted gently. "Unless I'd done something to upset them, or if Dudley said I'd been bothering him, or if there was something freaky that happened and they thought it was my fault." "Freaky things?" Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks. Even here, surrounded by magic and people who understood that strange things were normal, he felt the old shame and confusion about the incidents that had so enraged the Dursleys. "Things would happen sometimes," he said quietly. "Things I couldn't explain. My hair would grow back overnight after Aunt Petunia cut it too short, or I'd end up somewhere I shouldn't have been able to get to, or things would break or change when I was upset." "Magic things," McGonagall said softly. "Accidental magic, which is perfectly normal for untrained magical children." "But they said it was freaky," Harry said. "They said I was a freak, and that normal people didn't do things like that." Kingsley had stopped writing, and was looking at Harry with an expression of such profound sympathy that Harry felt compelled to look away. "Harry, what they called you was wrong. What happened to you when these magical incidents occurred?" "I'd get locked in my cupboard," Harry said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes for a day or two, sometimes longer. Uncle Vernon said I needed to think about what I'd done and learn to control myself. Were you given food and water during these times?" "Eventually." "When they remembered." The silence that followed this admission was so complete that Harry could hear his own heartbeat. When he looked up, he saw that McGonagall had turned away and was staring out the window with her shoulders rigid, while Kingsley was very carefully setting down his quill. "Harry," Kingsley said finally, "I need to ask you about times when you were physically hurt. Can you tell me about any incidents where your aunt or uncle or cousin caused you pain?" This was the question Harry had been dreading, partly because he wasn't sure how to answer it. The idea that the Dursleys had deliberately hurt him felt wrong, somehow. Uncle Vernon's shoves and slaps had always been presented as consequences for Harry's misbehavior, not as unprovoked violence. "Sometimes Uncle Vernon would get really angry," Harry said slowly, "especially if something freaky happened at school, or if the neighbors complained about something, or if I'd broken something. What would he do when he got angry? Shout, mostly. Sometimes he'd grab me and shake me, or push me out of the way. Sometimes he'd slap me, but not very hard," Harry added quickly, not wanting to get Uncle Vernon in more trouble than necessary. "Did these incidents ever result in injuries?" "Sometimes I'd have bruises," Harry admitted, "and once he pushed me down the stairs when I wasn't moving fast enough, and my arm hurt for a long time afterward." "How long is a long time?" "Maybe a month. It was hard to use it properly, and it ached all the time, but it got better eventually." Kingsley made more notes, and Harry could see him exchanging meaningful looks with McGonagall over his head. "What about your cousin Dudley?" "Dudley liked to play games," Harry said, choosing his words carefully. "Harry hunting, he called it, with his friends from school. They'd chase me around the neighborhood and try to catch me." "What would happen if they caught you?" Harry shrugged, though the casual gesture belied the knot of anxiety in his stomach. "They'd rough me up a bit. Nothing serious. Just kid stuff, really." "Can you be more specific about what roughing up involved?" This was harder to explain, because Harry had never thought of Dudley's treatment as anything other than typical big cousin behavior. The fact that other children might not experience similar treatment from their relatives was a concept he was still struggling to understand. "Pushing, mostly. Sometimes punching, but not in the face where people would see. Dudley was careful about that. Sometimes they'd hold me down, and I don't know, just mess with me until they got bored." "Did any of these incidents result in injuries serious enough that you couldn't move normally or perform your daily activities?" Harry thought about this carefully. There had been the time when Dudley's friend Piers had kicked him in the ribs so hard he'd had trouble breathing for weeks. The incident when Dudley had twisted his arm behind his back until something had popped, and the arm had been essentially useless for more than a month. The time they'd thrown him down so hard that his tailbone had ached for the entire summer. "Sometimes," he said finally. "But I managed." "You managed," Kingsley repeated, and there was something in his voice that made Harry look up sharply. "I mean, I still did my chores and everything. I just had to be more careful, or do things differently until I felt better." "Harry," McGonagall said, and her voice was very carefully controlled, "children shouldn't have to manage after being hurt by their family members. They should receive medical care and protection." "But I wasn't really hurt," Harry protested. "Not seriously. I could still walk and talk and everything." The look that passed between the two adults was loaded with meaning that Harry couldn't quite decipher, though he sensed it had to do with his understanding of what constituted serious injury being significantly different from theirs. Kingsley asked more questions, about school, about social services visits, about whether any teachers had ever expressed concern about his welfare. Harry answered as best he could, though many of the questions seemed to be based on assumptions about how normal childhood functioned that didn't match his experience. When the formal interview was finished, Kingsley carefully rolled up his parchment and secured it with an official-looking seal. "Harry, you've been very brave to tell me about these things, and very helpful. What you've shared will be used to make sure you're safe and protected going forward." "What happens now?" Harry asked. "Now," said a new voice from the doorway, "we begin the process of ensuring that justice is served." Harry turned to see a stern-looking woman in formal ministry robes entering the hospital wing. She carried herself with the kind of authority that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed. But when she looked at Harry, her expression softened, with what appeared to be genuine compassion. "Harry," McGonagall said, standing as the newcomer approached, "I'd like you to meet Madam Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She's here to oversee the official investigation into your case." Amelia Bones moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent years making difficult decisions under pressure. She nodded briefly to Kingsley, who handed over his notes, then pulled up a chair and sat down facing Harry directly. "Mr. Potter," she said, and her voice carried the kind of formal weight that made Harry sit up straighter. "I've reviewed the medical evidence that Madam Pumphrey has provided, and I've read Aura Shacklebolt's initial interview notes. Based on this information, I'm opening a formal investigation into your treatment while in the custody of Vernon and Petunia Dursley." Harry wasn't sure what response was expected from him, so he simply nodded. "More importantly," Bones continued, "I'm issuing an immediate protection order that prevents anyone from forcing you to return to Privet Drive while this investigation is ongoing. You are officially under the protection of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." The words official protection felt large and important in a way Harry couldn't quite process. He had never been officially anything before, except perhaps officially unwanted. "There are some irregularities in your guardianship arrangements that we need to address," Bones said, consulting a thick file she'd brought with her. "It appears that the proper legal procedures for placing you with your relatives were never completed." This was news to McGonagall as well. Harry could tell from her sharp intake of breath. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means," Bones said grimly, "that Harry's placement with the Dursleys was never legally formalized through the appropriate magical authorities. No home study was conducted, no formal guardianship papers were filed, no oversight mechanisms were put in place." She turned back to Harry. "In essence, Mr. Potter, you were placed in an unsupervised, legally questionable living situation without any of the protections that should have been in place for an orphaned magical child." "But Dumbledore said," McGonagall began, then stopped herself. "Yes," Bones said, with a slight edge to her voice. "Professor Dumbledore will need to answer some very serious questions about his role in this arrangement, as will several other parties who should have been providing oversight." Harry found himself thinking of Mrs. Figg, who had watched him for years and never said anything about the bruises or his obvious fear of the Dursleys. Had she been part of some official arrangement, or simply a neighbour who had been told to look the other way? "Madam Bones," he said tentatively, "what will happen to my aunt and uncle?" "They will be formally charged with child endangerment and abuse," she replied without hesitation. "The magical evidence is quite clear about the nature and extent of your treatment. They will face trial before the Wizengamot." "And to me?" "You," she said, and for the first time since entering the room, she smiled, "will be placed in proper care while we determine the best permanent arrangements for your future. Professor McGonagall has volunteered to serve as your temporary guardian, and frankly, given your positive response to her care, that seems like an excellent starting point." Harry looked at McGonagall, who was watching him with the same protective expression she'd worn since discovering the extent of his mistreatment. The idea that someone actually wanted to take care of him, that an adult was volunteering to be responsible for his well-being, was so overwhelming that he felt tears threaten again. "Would you like that, Harry?" McGonagall asked gently. "Would you like to stay with me while we sort everything out?" Harry nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "Excellent," Bones said, making notes in her file. "I'll have the paperwork prepared immediately. In the meantime, Mr. Potter will remain here in the hospital wing until Madame Pomfrey clears him medically." She stood to leave, then paused and looked back at Harry. "Mr. Potter, I want you to understand something very clearly. What happened to you was wrong. It was illegal, it was immoral, and it should never have been allowed to continue. The adults who were supposed to protect you failed in their duty, and there will be consequences for that failure." After she left, the hospital wing felt strangely quiet. Harry sat in his comfortable bed, surrounded by adults who actually seemed to care about his welfare, and tried to process the idea that his suffering had been officially recognized as wrong. "Harry," McGonagall said softly, "how are you feeling about all of this?" It was such a simple question, but Harry found himself struggling to answer it. For the first time in his life, adults were asking him what he felt, what he wanted, what he needed. The idea that his opinions and preferences might actually matter in decisions about his future was as foreign as the magical world itself had been just days ago. "I'm not sure," he said finally. "It feels big, like everything's changing all at once." "Change can be frightening," she agreed, "even when it's change for the better. But you won't have to navigate it alone. You have people who care about you now, and we're going to make sure you're safe and happy going forward." As the afternoon wore on, Harry found himself thinking about the concept of justice. For 10 years, he had simply accepted his treatment as normal, had absorbed the Dursleys' insistence that he was lucky to have a roof over his head and food in his stomach. But now, surrounded by adults who were horrified by what had been done to him, Harry was beginning to understand that perhaps he deserved something more than mere survival. Perhaps he deserved to be safe. Perhaps he deserved to be cared for. Perhaps he deserved to be loved. It was a revolutionary thought, and as he drifted off to sleep that evening, Harry Potter allowed himself to imagine a future where those things might actually be true. Chapter 4. Emergency Guardianship. The emergency session of the Wizengamot convened at precisely 9 o'clock on Harry Potter's second morning at Hogwarts, though Harry himself was unaware that his fate was being deliberated in the imposing chambers deep within the Ministry of Magic. He was, instead, sitting in the hospital wing, finishing what Madame Pomfrey had assured him was a perfectly normal-sized breakfast, though the quantity of food still seemed impossible to Harry. 2 eggs, 3 strips of bacon, buttered toast with jam, fresh fruit, and a large glass of pumpkin juice. It was more food than he typically saw in an entire day at Privet Drive. Amelia Bones stood before the assembled members of the magical court, her voice carrying clearly through the ancient stone chamber, as she presented the evidence that had emerged from the investigation's first 24 hours. The medical documentation was damning enough, but when combined with Harry's own testimony and the revelation of the irregular guardianship arrangements, the picture that emerged was one of systematic institutional failure on multiple levels. "The evidence before us," Bones declared, her words recorded by quick quills that scratched across parchment with urgent efficiency, demonstrates not merely a case of domestic abuse, but a fundamental breakdown in our system of child protection. An orphaned magical child was placed in an unsupervised, legally questionable environment where he suffered years of documented physical abuse, deliberate malnutrition, and magical suppression. Chief Warlock Bagnold listened with the grim expression of someone who understood the political implications of what was being discussed. The wizarding world's faith in their institutions depended on the belief that magical children were protected and valued. The revelation that Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the symbol of their victory over dark magic, had been systematically abused, while under official protection, threatened to undermine public confidence in the entire system. "What are you requesting, Madam Bones?" Bagnold asked. I am requesting an emergency removal order preventing Harry Potter from being returned to the custody of Vernon and Petunia Dursley, pending the completion of our investigation, Bones replied. Additionally, I am requesting authorization to place Mr. Potter in temporary magical guardianship while we determine appropriate permanent arrangements. The murmur that ran through the chamber was subdued, but intense. Several members leaned forward in their seats, and Bones could see the careful political calculations taking place behind their expressions. "Has a suitable temporary guardian been identified?" asked Augusta Longbottom, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated the complexities of magical child-rearing under difficult circumstances. "Professor Minerva McGonagall has volunteered to serve as temporary guardian," Bones replied. "She has extensive experience with magical children, impeccable credentials, and has already established a protective relationship with Mr. Potter. The Hogwarts Board of Governors has unanimously endorsed this arrangement." What Bones didn't mention, though several members of the Wizengamot were undoubtedly aware of it, was that Albus Dumbledore had spent the previous evening attempting to mobilize opposition to McGonagall's guardianship proposal. He had sent urgent owls to several influential families, arguing that Harry's placement should remain under his direct authority as headmaster of Hogwarts and chief warlock of the Wizengamot. His efforts had been notably unsuccessful. The vote, when it came, was unanimous in favor of the emergency removal order. The temporary guardianship required more discussion. Several members wanted assurances about oversight and regular reviews, but within an hour, the legal framework was in place. Harry Potter would never again be forced to return to Privet Drive, and Professor McGonagall was now his officially appointed temporary guardian. Back at Hogwarts, McGonagall was conducting her own emergency meeting with the Hogwarts Board of Governors, who had requested an immediate briefing on the situation. The 12 witches and wizards who oversaw the school's operations had arrived within hours of receiving her urgent summons, and their collective expression of outrage upon hearing the details of Harry's treatment had been gratifying in its intensity. "Professor McGonagall," said Board Chairman Cornelius Fudge, his usually pompous demeanor subdued by the gravity of the situation, "you have our complete support in this matter. Whatever resources you need, whatever accommodations must be made, this board will ensure you have them." "Thank you," McGonagall replied, though she was already mentally cataloguing the practical challenges ahead. Temporary guardianship of an abused 11-year-old boy was not a responsibility she had ever expected to undertake, but looking at the determined faces around the conference table, she felt a surge of confidence that she would not be facing this challenge alone. "What about Dumbledore?" asked board member Griselda Marchbanks, her voice carefully neutral but her meaning clear. "Professor Dumbledore has expressed concerns about the legal proceedings and their potential impact on Mr. Potter's security," McGonagall replied diplomatically. "However, the Board of Governors has authority over student welfare matters, and our position is clear. Harry Potter's immediate safety and well-being take precedence over all other considerations." The subtext of this exchange was understood by everyone present. Dumbledore's objections to the guardianship arrangements had less to do with Harry's welfare than with his own loss of control over the boy's circumstances. For decades, Dumbledore had made unilateral decisions about Harry's life based on his interpretation of what the greater good required. The prospect of those decisions being subject to legal oversight and external authority was clearly unwelcome. Meanwhile, Harry was experiencing his first taste of what it meant to have someone actively concerned about his comfort and well-being. Madame Pomfrey had spent the morning explaining the various potions and treatments she would be administering over the coming weeks to address the physical effects of his maltreatment. "This one," she said, holding up a bottle of pale green liquid, "will help your body absorb nutrients more efficiently. The prolonged malnutrition has affected your digestive system, so we need to gradually restore normal function." Harry examined the potion with interest. It smelled faintly of mint and something else he couldn't identify. "Will it taste awful?" "Not awful," Pomfrey said with a slight smile. "Medicinal, certainly, but I've added a flavoring charm that should make it tolerable." She paused, studying his face with the careful attention he was beginning to associate with adults who who actually cared about his responses. "Harry, I want you to understand that all of these treatments are designed to help you feel better and grow properly. If anything causes you discomfort or distress, you must tell me immediately." The concept that his comfort mattered enough to modify medical treatment was so foreign that Harry simply nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The morning passed in a blur of medical consultations, legal documents delivered by ministry owls, and what appeared to be a steady stream of adult conversations that Harry could sense were about him, but which took place just outside his hearing. He was beginning to understand that his situation had implications far beyond his personal welfare, that there were political and institutional consequences to the revelation of his mistreatment that he couldn't fully comprehend. Around midday, McGonagall arrived in the hospital wing carrying an official-looking scroll sealed with the ministry's crest. Her expression was carefully composed, but Harry could see something that might have been satisfaction in her eyes. "Harry," she said, pulling up the chair that had become her customary seat beside his bed, "I have some news for you." Harry set down the book he'd been attempting to read, a primer on magical theory that Madame Pomfrey had provided, and gave her his full attention. "The Wizengamot has issued an official order," McGonagall continued, unrolling the parchment so that Harry could see the formal text. "You are never required to return to your aunt and uncle's house. That chapter of your life is permanently closed." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, carrying a weight that Harry could feel, but not quite articulate. Never. He would never again have to face Uncle Vernon's purple rage or Aunt Petunia's cold disapproval. Never again would he have to worry about being locked in his cupboard or going to bed hungry as punishment for some perceived transgression. "What does that mean for where I'll live?" he asked, his voice smaller than he'd intended. "It means," McGonagall said, and Harry could see her choosing her words with particular care, "that if you're willing, I would very much like you to come and live with me. The Wizengamot has approved me as your temporary guardian, while we sort out the longer-term arrangements." Harry stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. An adult was volunteering to take care of him. Not because they were being paid, not because they were being forced to by some official arrangement, but because they actually wanted to. "You want me to live with you?" he asked, needing to hear it confirmed. "Very much," McGonagall said, and her voice carried a warmth that made Harry's chest feel tight with emotions he couldn't name. "I have quarters here at Hogwarts with more than enough space for both of us, and I think you might be happier there than you've been anywhere else." Harry felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, though he couldn't have said whether they were tears of relief or gratitude or simple overwhelming emotion. "Yes," he whispered. "Please." McGonagall reached over and squeezed his hand gently. "Then it's settled. You'll be coming home with me." Home. The word carried connotations that Harry had never associated with his own living situation. The Dursley house had been the place where he was required to stay, where he performed his functions and tried to avoid trouble. But the idea of home as a place where he was wanted, where he belonged, where someone was glad to have him, that was entirely new. The afternoon brought practical considerations that Harry had never had to think about before. McGonagall had contacted Madame Malkin's shop in Diagon Alley to arrange for proper clothes to be sent to Hogwarts, clothes that would actually fit Harry, rather than the oversized hand-me-downs that had been his entire wardrobe for as long as he could remember. "What kind of clothes do you like?" McGonagall asked, consulting a letter from the shop. It was such a simple question, but Harry found himself completely at a loss for an answer. He had never been asked what kind of clothes he liked. His entire experience with clothing had been wearing whatever Dudley had outgrown, regardless of fit or personal preference. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I've never really thought about it." McGonagall studied his face with an expression that might have been sadness. "Well then, we'll start with the basics, and you can discover your preferences as we go along. Comfortable clothes for everyday wear, proper robes for school, perhaps some nice things for special occasions. The idea that he might have preferences about clothing, that his comfort and personal taste might actually be factors in what he wore, was another small revolution in Harry's understanding of how his life might function going forward. While McGonagall handled the practical arrangements, Harry found himself thinking about the conversation he'd overheard between two junior ministry employees who had delivered some paperwork earlier in the day. They had been discussing the financial irregularities that the investigation had uncovered. Apparently, substantial sums of money had been paid to the Dursleys over the years for Harry's care, money that had clearly never been used for its intended purpose. "Madam Pomfrey," Harry said when she came to check on him later in the afternoon, "someone mentioned that my relatives were paid money to take care of me. Where did that money come from?" Pomfrey paused in her examination of his latest blood work results. "That's a complicated question, Harry, and one that involves some rather unpleasant legal proceedings. But in simple terms, yes, your parents left you a considerable inheritance, and portions of it were supposed to be used to ensure your proper care." "They kept money that was supposed to be for me?" "It appears so," she said gently, "though that's a matter for the legal authorities to sort out. What I can tell you is that your financial situation is quite secure, and Professor McGonagall will help you understand all of that when you're ready. The revelation that the Dursleys had not only abused and neglected him, but had been paid substantial sums to provide the care they had withheld, was another layer of betrayal that Harry wasn't sure how to process. But it was also, in some strange way, a relief. The money proved that his parents had tried to provide for him, that they had anticipated his needs and made arrangements for them to be met. The fact that those arrangements had been subverted was not their failure. Evening approached with the soft, golden light that seemed to characterize early autumn at Hogwarts. Harry had spent the day in the hospital wing, but McGonagall had suggested that he might be ready to see his new living situation if Madame Pomfrey approved. "I think a change of scenery would do him good," Pomfrey said, after completing her evening examination. "His vital signs are improving steadily, and psychologically, I believe he needs to begin experiencing normal domestic life." McGonagall's quarters were located in Gryffindor Tower, accessible through a portrait of a stern-looking wizard who examined Harry carefully before swinging open to reveal a comfortable sitting room beyond. The space was larger than Harry had expected, with tall windows that looked out over the Hogwarts grounds and furniture that managed to be both elegant and inviting. "This will be your room," McGonagall said, opening a door off the main sitting area to reveal a space that made Harry's breath catch in his throat. The room was perhaps 3 times the size of the cupboard under the stairs, with a proper bed covered in soft blankets, a writing desk positioned near a window that provided natural light, and shelves that were clearly intended for books and personal belongings. There was a wardrobe for clothes and a comfortable chair for reading. Most remarkably, there were decorations, framed pictures of landscapes, a small banner with what appeared to be a coat of arms, and several objects that seemed to have been placed simply because they were pleasant to look at. "It's beautiful," Harry said quietly. And he meant it. The room represented everything he had never known to want: privacy, comfort, and the sense that someone had cared enough to make the space welcoming. "I'm glad you like it," McGonagall said. "You're welcome to change anything you'd like. Add your own decorations, rearrange the furniture, however makes you comfortable. This is your space." Your space. Harry had never had space that belonged to him, space that he could modify according to his own preferences. The concept was overwhelming in its implications. They had dinner together in the small dining area adjacent to McGonagall's kitchen, a meal that she had prepared herself with obvious care. The food was simple but delicious: roast chicken with vegetables, fresh bread, and apple tart for dessert. But more than the food, Harry was struck by the experience of eating a meal with someone who seemed genuinely interested in his conversation, who asked about his thoughts and opinions, and listened to his answers with real attention. "Tell me about your friends," McGonagall said as they shared the apple tart. "Mr. Weasley and Miss Granger, weren't they? I saw them asking about you earlier today." "Ron and Hermione," Harry said, feeling a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. I've never really had friends before, but they seem to actually like me, not just because of the whole boy who lived thing. Real friends are one of life's greatest gifts, McGonagall said seriously. I'm glad you found them so quickly. As the evening progressed, Harry found himself experiencing something he had never expected, the simple pleasure of spending time with an adult who enjoyed his company. McGonagall told him stories about her own childhood, asked about his interests and concerns, and treated his opinions with the kind of respect he had never experienced from adult authority figures. When it came time for bed, McGonagall showed him the bathroom that adjoined his room, his own bathroom, with towels that were soft and warm, toiletries that were new and intended specifically for his use, and a mirror that reflected his image without criticism or disparagement. If you need anything during the night, McGonagall said, anything at all, you need only call out and I'll hear you. There are no locked doors here, Harry, and no punishments for asking for help. Harry nodded, though the concepts she was describing felt foreign enough that he wasn't sure how to respond to them. Alone in his room, his own room, Harry sat on the edge of his new bed and tried to process the day's revelations. He was officially free from the Dursleys. He had a guardian who actually wanted to care for him. He had a safe, comfortable place to live, and adults who were committed to his well-being. But perhaps most remarkably, he was beginning to understand that the voice in his head that had always told him he was worthless, that he deserved whatever treatment he received, that he should be grateful for even the most meager kindness, that voice had been wrong. He deserved safety. He deserved care. He deserved to have adults in his life who valued his happiness and protected his well-being. It was a revolutionary thought, and as Harry settled into his new bed between sheets that smelled of lavender and felt softer than anything he had ever experienced, he allowed himself to imagine a future where those things would simply be true, where he wouldn't have to fight for basic care and respect. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter fell asleep feeling completely safe, surrounded by the knowledge that someone who cared about him was just a room away, ready to respond if he needed anything at all. In the sitting room beyond his door, McGonagall sat at her desk working on the paperwork that would formalize his temporary guardianship, but she found her attention drifting repeatedly to the quiet sounds of a child settling peacefully into sleep. She had spent decades caring for students, but this felt different, more personal and more profound. She was not just housing a student or providing temporary assistance. She was offering a home to a child who had never known what home could mean, and the responsibility was both daunting and deeply meaningful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, continued medical treatment, educational planning, the ongoing legal proceedings that would determine Harry's permanent future. But tonight, Harry Potter was safe and warm and wanted, sleeping peacefully in a room that belonged to him, under the protection of someone who had chosen to love him. It was a beginning, and it was enough. Chapter 5. Adjustment and Recovery. Harry woke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight streaming across his face without the accompanying dread of impending chores or punishment. For a disorienting moment, he lay still in the comfortable bed, trying to remember where he was and why he felt so safe. Then the events of the previous days came flooding back: the medical examination, the investigation, McGonagall's offer of guardianship, and his first night in what she had called home. The room was exactly as he had left it the night before, which was remarkable in itself. At Privet Drive, Harry had learned never to leave anything where it might be seen and confiscated, but here his few possessions remained undisturbed on the bedside table. The book McGonagall had given him about magical theory, the small pot of salve from Madame Pomfrey for the lingering soreness in his ribs, and most precious of all, a photograph of his parents that Professor McGonagall had produced from somewhere in the castle's archives. A soft knock at his door interrupted his morning contemplation. "Harry?" McGonagall's voice was gentle, questioning rather than demanding. Are you awake?" "Yes," he called back, sitting up in bed and realizing with surprise that he felt genuinely rested for the first time in recent memory. "May I come in?" The fact that she asked permission was another small wonder. Harry had grown accustomed to his space being invaded at will by Uncle Vernon or Dudley, his privacy contingent on their moods rather than any inherent right to solitude. "Of course," he said, and McGonagall entered carrying a breakfast tray that made his eyes widen with familiar disbelief. "I thought you might like to eat in your room this morning," she said, settling the tray on his bedside table. "Though in future you're welcome to join me in the kitchen whenever you prefer. Breakfast is meant to be a pleasant meal, not a hurried obligation." Harry stared at the tray, porridge with cream and honey, fresh fruit, buttered toast, and a pot of tea that smelled of bergamot and warmth. It was more food than he would have received in 3 days at the Dursleys, presented not as a grudging necessity, but as something to be enjoyed. "This is all for me?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. McGonagall paused in arranging his napkin and really looked at him, her green eyes sharp with the kind of attention that missed nothing. "Yes, Harry, all for you, and there's more in the kitchen if you're still hungry afterward." The concept of still hungry afterward was so foreign that Harry didn't know how to respond to it. In his experience, meals ended when the food was gone, not when his hunger was satisfied. "Professor McGonagall," he said carefully, "are you sure this is all right? I mean, this much food must be expensive, and I don't want to be a burden or anything." She sat down in the chair beside his bed with the kind of deliberate care that suggested his words had affected her more than she wanted to show. "Harry, you are not now, nor will you ever be, a burden. Providing for your needs, all of your needs, including proper nutrition, is not just my responsibility as your guardian, it's my privilege. Do you understand?" Harry nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood at all. The idea that caring for him could be a privilege rather than an unwanted obligation was as revolutionary as magic itself had been just days ago. As he ate breakfast, slowly, savouring each bite in a way that would have earned him lectures about gratitude from Aunt Petunia, McGonagall outlined the day ahead. There would be another session with Madame Pomfrey to continue his medical treatment, a visit from Professor Flitwick, who had volunteered to help assess his educational needs, and perhaps, if Harry felt ready, a chance to visit with Ron and Hermione. "The other students have been asking about you," she said with a slight smile. "Mr. Weasley in particular has been quite insistent that someone should check whether you need anything. I believe he's prepared to mount a rescue mission if he doesn't hear from you soon." The idea that someone was worried about him, that peers his own age were actively concerned for his welfare, was another adjustment Harry was struggling to process. At his Muggle primary school, he had been largely invisible, except when serving as Dudley's preferred target for humiliation. The concept of friends who actually cared about his well-being was still too new to feel entirely real. After breakfast, McGonagall showed Harry how to use the wardrobe charm that would keep his new clothes properly organized, taught him the password for the portrait that guarded their quarters, and most importantly, explained that he was free to come and go as he pleased within the boundaries of Hogwarts. "You're not confined to these rooms," she said firmly. "You're welcome to explore the castle, visit the library, spend time in the Great Hall with other students. The only restriction is that I'd like to know where you're going, not because you need permission, but because I care about your safety and want to be able to find you if you need anything." The distinction between restriction and care was subtle but profound. Harry had spent years having his movements controlled through locks and threats and punishments. The idea that someone might want to know his whereabouts out of genuine concern rather than a desire to control him was another small revolution in his understanding of how relationships could function. Their first stop was the hospital wing, where Madame Pomfrey greeted Harry with the kind of professional warmth that was becoming familiar. She had prepared a series of potions designed to address the long-term effects of malnutrition, and she explained each one with the patience of someone who understood that Harry needed to feel informed about his own treatment. "This one will help your body process nutrients more efficiently," she said, holding up a bottle of pale blue liquid that sparkled slightly in the morning light. "Your digestive system has been compromised by years of irregular and inadequate nutrition, so we need to retrain it to function properly." "Will it hurt?" Harry asked, remembering the bitter medicines Aunt Petunia had occasionally forced him to take when his illnesses threatened to disrupt her carefully ordered household. "It shouldn't," Pomfrey replied. "I've added flavoring charms to make them more palatable. But if you experience any discomfort, any at all, you must tell me immediately. Your comfort is important, Harry, and there's no virtue in suffering unnecessarily." The idea that his comfort was important, that avoiding unnecessary suffering was a reasonable goal rather than an indulgence, was another concept Harry was still learning to accept. The potion tasted faintly of strawberries and left a warm sensation in his stomach that was actually rather pleasant. Pomfrey monitored his reaction carefully, asking detailed questions about how he felt and making notes that would guide future treatments. "Your magical signature is already stronger than it was yesterday," she observed, consulting a device that looked like a combination of telescope and kaleidoscope. "The suppression effects are diminishing rapidly now that you're in a safe, nurturing environment. Magic responds to emotional well-being as much as physical health." While Pomfrey completed her examination, Harry found himself thinking about the concept of magical suppression. The idea that his own power had been diminished by years of emotional trauma was disturbing, but also strangely validating. It suggested that his sense of being different, of being less than he should be, had been accurate in ways he couldn't have imagined. "Madam Pomfrey," he said hesitantly, "will my magic be normal? Eventually, I mean." "Harry," she said, setting aside her instruments and giving him her full attention, "your magic was never abnormal. It was merely suppressed by circumstances that should never have been allowed to continue. With proper care and a supportive environment, you'll develop into exactly the wizard you were meant to be." The phrase, "exactly the wizard you were meant to be," resonated with something deep in Harry's chest. For years he had been told by the Dursleys that he was an aberration, a mistake, something that needed to be hidden and controlled. The idea that there was a version of himself he was meant to be, and that this version was not only acceptable but worth nurturing, was profoundly healing in ways he couldn't fully articulate. After his medical appointment, McGonagall escorted Harry to what she called her office hours room, where Professor Flitwick was waiting with an assortment of books and what appeared to be diagnostic materials for magical education. Professor Flitwick was perhaps the least intimidating teacher Harry had ever encountered. Small in stature but large in presence, he radiated the kind of enthusiasm for his subject that made learning feel like an adventure rather than an obligation. "Mr. Potter," he exclaimed, hopping down from his specially designed chair to greet Harry with a warm handshake. "I've been looking forward to meeting you properly. Professor McGonagall has told me that we need to assess your educational background and determine the best way to help you catch up with your peers." The phrase, "catch up with your peers," might have been anxiety-inducing in another context, but Flitwick's delivery made it sound like an exciting challenge rather than a deficit to be ashamed of. "I'm not sure how much I know," Harry admitted. "The Dursleys didn't really— I went to school, but they didn't encourage studying or anything like that." "That's perfectly understandable," Flitwick said, with the kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that made Harry's shoulders relax. "Many magical children arrive at Hogwarts with irregular educational backgrounds. Our job is simply to figure out where you are now and help you get where you want to be." The next hour was unlike any educational experience Harry had ever had. Instead of testing his knowledge in order to judge or categorize him, Flitwick seemed genuinely curious about how Harry's mind worked, what subjects interested him, and what kind of learning environment would best support his development. "You have excellent analytical skills," Flitwick observed, after Harry had worked through a series of logical puzzles. "And your magical intuition is quite strong, despite the suppression effects you've experienced. I think you'll find that learning magic comes more naturally than you might expect." They discussed books Harry had read, mostly whatever he could sneak from the school library without attracting Dudley's attention, and Flitwick made notes about areas where additional support might be helpful. But more than the academic assessment, Harry was struck by the professor's obvious assumption that Harry wanted to learn, that education was something to be pursued for its own sake rather than endured as a necessary evil. "I'd like to propose a modified tutorial schedule for you," Flitwick said, as their session concluded. "Nothing too intensive. Your primary focus should be on recovery and adjustment, but some individual sessions that will help you feel confident when you join regular classes with your year mates." The idea that his confidence was a priority, that adults were willing to modify their teaching to support his emotional well-being rather than simply demanding that he meet arbitrary standards, was yet another revelation in what was becoming a day full of them. When they returned to McGonagall's quarters for lunch, Harry found a gift waiting for him, a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, with a card that bore Hagrid's distinctive handwriting. "Thought you might enjoy these." Hagrid. Inside were a collection of what appeared to be homemade rock cakes, several books about magical creatures, and most touching of all, a small carved wooden figure of an owl that looked remarkably like Hedwig. "Hagrid's been worried about you," McGonagall explained, as Harry examined the gifts with wonder. "He wanted to visit, but I thought you might need a few more days to settle in before dealing with too many visitors. He understands, but he wanted to make sure you knew he was thinking of you." Harry turned the wooden owl over in his hands, marveling at the detailed carving. The idea that someone had taken time to create something specifically for him, something that served no practical purpose except to bring him joy, was almost overwhelming. "Can I write him a thank-you note?" Harry asked. "Of course," McGonagall said. "In fact, I think he would be delighted to hear from you." Writing the thank-you note proved to be more emotionally complex than Harry had anticipated. He had never been in a position to express genuine gratitude for a gift given freely, without expectation or obligation. The words felt strange on the page, but also important in a way he couldn't fully explain. That afternoon, McGonagall suggested they take a walk around the Hogwarts grounds. "Fresh air and exercise are important parts of recovery," she said, "and I thought you might enjoy seeing more of your new home." The word home still felt foreign when applied to his living situation, but as they walked through the castle corridors and out onto the expansive lawns, Harry began to understand what she meant. This was a place where he belonged, where he was wanted, where his presence was valued rather than tolerated. They encountered several students during their walk, and Harry was struck by how they greeted him, not with the curiosity or mockery he had experienced at his Muggle school, but with genuine friendliness and respect. A few seventh-year students from Gryffindor even stopped to ask how he was feeling and whether he needed anything. "Word has gotten around," McGonagall explained quietly as they continued their walk. "Not the details, of course, those remain confidential, but the general understanding that you've been through a difficult time and deserve support. The magical community takes care of its own, Harry, and you're very much part of that community now." Near the lake, they encountered Ron and Hermione, who had apparently been watching for Harry's appearance with the kind of vigilant concern that suggested they had been genuinely worried about him. "Harry!" Ron called out, jogging over with Hermione close behind. "We've been wondering how you were doing. Are you all right? Do you need anything?" Hermione's been reading about recovery from difficult situations, and she has some ideas about things that might help. Hermione flushed slightly at Ron's disclosure of her research, but her expression was earnest and caring. "I just thought... if you wanted to talk about anything, or if there were ways we could help you feel more comfortable here, we'd like to know. Harry looked at his friends, and he was beginning to accept that they truly were friends, not just people who tolerated his presence, and felt something warm and unfamiliar spread through his chest. They cared about him. Not because he was famous, not because they wanted something from him, but simply because they liked him and wanted him to be happy. "I'm doing well," he said, and realized with surprise that it was true. "Really well, actually. Professor McGonagall has been taking excellent care of me." They spent an hour by the lake, talking about classes and Quidditch and the various personalities among their fellow students. For the first time, Harry felt like he was participating in the kind of normal peer interaction he had observed but never experienced. Ron and Hermione included him naturally in their conversation, asked for his opinions, and treated his responses with genuine interest. "You seem different," Hermione observed, as they prepared to head back to the castle. "Happier, I mean. More relaxed." Harry considered this assessment. "I think I'm learning what it feels like to be safe," he said finally. "I've never really had that before." The simple honesty of this statement seemed to affect his friends deeply. Ron's ears went red, and Hermione's eyes filled with tears she was clearly trying to hide. "Well," Ron said gruffly, "you're safe now. And if anyone tries to change that, they'll have to go through us first." The fierce loyalty in his voice was matched by Hermione's determined nod, and Harry felt that warm sensation in his chest intensify. These people cared about him enough to fight for him, to protect him, to stand between him and anyone who might hurt him. It was a kind of security he had never imagined possible. That evening, McGonagall introduced Harry to another new experience, choosing what to eat for dinner. She had prepared several options and invited him to select whatever appealed to him, explaining that meals should be enjoyable rather than simply functional. "At the Dursleys'," Harry found himself saying as they sat down to eat, "I usually just ate whatever they gave me, when they gave it to me. I never really thought about what I liked." "And now?" McGonagall asked gently. Harry considered the question seriously, tasting the different dishes she had prepared. "I think I like things that are warm and flavorful, and I like having enough that I don't have to worry about whether there will be more." "Those are perfectly reasonable preferences," she said, "and easily accommodated. Part of recovery is learning to recognize and honor your own needs, including something as basic as food preferences." After dinner, as Harry helped with the washing up, not because it was expected, but because he wanted to contribute, McGonagall made an observation that would stick with him for years to come. "You know, Harry," she said, drying the plates he had washed, "I've been thinking about courage. The magical world considers you a hero because you survived Voldemort's attack as a baby. But I think the real courage has been what you've done since, surviving 10 years of mistreatment without becoming bitter or cruel yourself. That takes a strength that many adults never develop." Harry paused in his dishwashing, struck by her words. He had never thought of survival as courage, had never considered that maintaining his capacity for kindness, despite years of unkindness, might be a strength worth recognizing. "I didn't feel courageous," he said quietly. "Most of the time, I just felt scared and confused." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," McGonagall replied. "It's choosing to do what's right despite being afraid. And you've been doing that your entire life." That night, as Harry prepared for bed in his comfortable room with its soft blankets and protective quiet, he reflected on the day's experiences. He was beginning to understand that recovery wasn't just about healing from what had been done to him. It was about learning who he could become when he was safe and valued and loved. For the first time, he was starting to believe that person might be worth knowing. As he drifted off to sleep, Harry Potter allowed himself to imagine a future where this feeling of safety and belonging wasn't temporary, where the adults in his life continued to prioritize his well-being, where friends cared about him for who he was rather than what he represented. It was a radical departure from every expectation he had learned to have about his life, and it was absolutely wonderful. Chapter 6. Uncovering the Full Truth. The revelation came not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of an autumn rain that gradually soaked through everything until there was no part of the landscape left untouched. Amelia Bones sat in her ministry office at 6:30 in the morning, reading through the investigative reports that had arrived throughout the night, each one adding another layer to what was becoming a picture of institutional betrayal so comprehensive that she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the wizarding world's moral leadership. The Muggle neighbours on Privet Drive had been surprisingly forthcoming once ministry investigators had applied the appropriate memory charms to facilitate honest conversation. Mrs. Number 7 had vivid recollections of a thin boy doing garden work in all weather while the family's large son played inside. Mr. Number 5 remembered distinctly odd incidents, broken windows that repaired themselves overnight, garden gnomes that appeared and disappeared without explanation, and most disturbing of all, the sound of shouting and what might have been violence coming from Number 4 during the long summer months when the boy was home from his special school. But it was the testimony of Mrs. Arabella Figg that had shattered any remaining hope that Harry's suffering had been the result of oversight or miscommunication rather than deliberate policy. Harry was in McGonagall's quarters, working on a transfiguration essay that Professor McGonagall had assigned, not because it was required coursework, but because she had observed his obvious aptitude for the subject and wanted to nurture his confidence through academic success. He was discovering that he enjoyed learning when it was presented as an opportunity rather than an obligation, when his questions were welcomed rather than dismissed as inconvenient interruptions. The comfortable routine of his new life, breakfast with McGonagall, morning classes adapted to his needs, afternoon time with Ron and Hermione, evening conversations over dinner that ranged from magical theory to favourite books, had begun to feel natural rather than miraculous. He was learning to trust that food would be available when he was hungry, that adults would respond to his needs with care rather than irritation, that his safety was a given rather than something he had to earn through perfect behaviour, which made the interruption, when it came, all the more jarring. McGonagall entered the sitting room with an expression Harry had never seen before, a kind of cold, controlled fury that made the air around her seem to crackle with barely contained magic. Behind her came Amelia Bones, carrying a thick file that seemed to radiate ominous significance. "Harry," McGonagall said, her voice carefully modulated, but unable to completely mask the rage beneath. "Madam Bones needs to speak with both of us about some new information that's come to light. I think you should sit down." Harry set aside his essay, noting with the hypervigilance that years of abuse had taught him that both women looked as though they had received devastating news. The familiar knot of anxiety began to form in his stomach as he tried to imagine what he might have done wrong. What aspect of his new life was about to be revealed as temporary or conditional? "Mr. Potter," Bones said, settling into a chair across from him, with the careful movements of someone who was trying very hard to maintain professional composure. "The investigation into your case has uncovered some additional information that you have a right to know. However, I want to warn you that what I'm about to tell you may be very difficult to hear." Harry nodded, though his throat felt suddenly dry. He had learned to brace himself for bad news, to prepare mentally for the revelation that something good in his life was actually too good to be true. "We've been conducting interviews with people who were aware of your living situation over the years," Bones continued. "Neighbours, school officials, and most importantly, Mrs. Arabella Figg." The name meant nothing to Harry beyond a vague recollection of an elderly woman who lived nearby and occasionally looked after him when the Dursleys went out. He had always assumed she was simply a neighbour who had been pressed into service when no other options were available. "Mrs. Figg," Bones said, opening her file and consulting what appeared to be detailed interview notes, "is a squib who was placed in your neighbourhood specifically to monitor your welfare. She has been filing reports about your treatment with the Dursleys for the past 10 years. Harry felt something cold settle in his chest. Reports to whom? To Professor Dumbledore, McGonagall said, and Harry could hear the effort it was taking her to keep her voice level. She was acting under his direct orders. The implications of this information took a moment to penetrate Harry's consciousness. Mrs. Figg had been watching him. She had been observing his treatment at the hands of the Dursleys and reporting back to Dumbledore. Which meant, he knew, Harry said quietly. Professor Dumbledore knew what they were doing to me. Yes, Bones confirmed. Mrs. Figg's reports are quite detailed. She documented incidents of physical violence, prolonged periods when you were denied food, times when you were locked in your cupboard for days at a time. She also reported several instances when she attempted to intervene on your behalf and was explicitly ordered by Professor Dumbledore to maintain her distance. McGonagall made a sound that might have been a suppressed curse. What exactly did she report? Bones consulted her notes. She documented the summer when you were 7, and Mr. Dursley pushed you down the stairs, resulting in what appeared to be a broken arm that was never treated. She reported the incident when you were 9, and were locked in your cupboard for 6 days without food after an episode of accidental magic. She described multiple occasions when you appeared to be suffering from malnutrition and requested permission to provide additional nutrition, which was denied. Harry listened to the litany of his childhood suffering with a growing sense of unreality. These weren't just things that had happened to him. They were things that had been observed, documented, and reported to the one adult in the magical world who had the authority and responsibility to intervene. What did Professor Dumbledore say when she reported these things? Harry asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. According to Mrs. Figg's testimony, Bones said, her voice carefully professional, Professor Dumbledore acknowledged her reports, but maintained that a certain amount of hardship was necessary to prevent you from developing an inflated sense of self-importance. He specifically stated that you needed to learn humility and resilience before entering the wizarding world. The words hit Harry like a physical blow. The careful, deliberate language couldn't disguise the essential truth. His suffering had been intentional. The hunger, the violence, the isolation, the constant fear, all of it had been orchestrated by the one person he had been taught to trust above all others. He thought starving me and letting them beat me would build character, Harry said, and his voice sounded strange in his own ears, too calm given the magnitude of what he was learning. That appears to be the case. Yes, Bones replied gently. McGonagall stood abruptly and walked to the window, her hands clenched at her sides. When she spoke, her voice was thick with barely suppressed rage. I want to see the reports, all of them. Minerva, Bones said carefully. I'm not sure that's advisable. The content is quite disturbing, and I'm concerned about... I want to see every single report, McGonagall repeated, turning back to face them. I want to understand the full scope of what that man allowed to happen to a child under his protection. Harry found himself studying McGonagall's face, noting the way her features had hardened into an expression of implacable fury. It was oddly comforting to see an adult responding to the revelation of his abuse with such unequivocal outrage. For so long, he had internalized the Dursleys' insistence that his treatment was normal, deserved, or at minimum, not worthy of concern. There's more, Bones said, and the warning in her tone made both Harry and McGonagall tense. We've also discovered Professor Dumbledore's own surveillance records. He maintained detailed files on your development, including magical monitoring and what appear to be psychological assessments. She produced a second, thicker file from her briefcase. These documents make it clear that Professor Dumbledore was not simply aware of your mistreatment, but was actively managing it as part of what he termed essential preparation for your future responsibilities. Harry felt something inside him begin to crumble. What future responsibilities? According to these files, Bones said, her voice very gentle, Professor Dumbledore believed that you would need to sacrifice yourself to defeat Voldemort. He felt that a comfortable childhood would make you too attached to life to make that sacrifice willingly when the time came. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that Harry could hear his own heartbeat. He stared at Bones, trying to process what she had just told him. Dumbledore had orchestrated years of abuse, because he wanted Harry to be willing to die when it became convenient for the war effort. "He raised me like a pig for slaughter," Harry said finally, and the matter-of-fact tone of his own voice surprised him. "Harry," McGonagall said, moving quickly to kneel beside his chair, "you need to understand that what Professor Dumbledore did was wrong. Profoundly, unforgivably wrong. No adult had the right to make those decisions about your life, and no cause, no matter how noble, justifies what you were subjected to." Harry looked at her, noting the tears that she was clearly trying to hold back. But he was right, wasn't he? I mean, if I do have to fight Voldemort eventually, maybe it was better that I didn't get used to being happy. Maybe it would be harder to do what needs to be done if I actually enjoyed being alive. The sound McGonagall made was somewhere between a sob and a growl. "Harry Potter, you listen to me very carefully. Your life has value beyond whatever role you might play in any war. You deserve happiness and safety and love, not because they'll make you a better weapon, but because you are a human being with inherent worth. Do you understand me?" Harry nodded, though he wasn't sure he did understand. The idea that his life had value, independent of his usefulness in fighting Voldemort, was difficult to process. For as long as he could remember, he had been defined by his relationship to his parents' sacrifice and his destined conflict with their murderer. The possibility that he might have worth as simply Harry, rather than Harry Potter, the boy who lived, was a concept he had never seriously considered. "What else is in the files?" he asked, partly because he needed to know, and partly because he couldn't bear to sit with his own thoughts any longer. Bones consulted her notes again. "There are detailed records of your magical development, including deliberate efforts to suppress your abilities during your early childhood. There are psychological profiles that analyze your responses to various forms of stress and trauma. And there are—" She paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase something particularly difficult. "There are contingency plans for what Professor Dumbledore called managing your emotional attachments, to ensure they didn't interfere with his long-term strategic objectives." "Managing my emotional attachments?" Harry repeated. "Plans to separate you from anyone you became too fond of, to ensure that you remained isolated and dependent on his guidance, rather than developing strong relationships that might motivate you to choose your own survival over the greater good." Harry thought about the friends he was just beginning to trust, about McGonagall's patient care, about the sense of belonging he had started to feel at Hogwarts. The idea that Dumbledore had been prepared to systematically destroy any happiness he found was somehow more devastating than the revelation of the deliberate abuse. "He wasn't going to let me keep any of this," Harry said, gesturing vaguely at the comfortable room, at McGonagall, at the life he was just learning to value. "He was going to take it all away when he decided I was getting too attached." "Yes," Bones confirmed quietly. "That appears to have been his intention." McGonagall's hands were shaking now with barely suppressed rage. "Amelia, I want to know what charges are being filed and when that man will be arrested, because I swear to you, if he walks free after this—" "The charges are being finalized now," Bones assured her. "Child endangerment, abuse of authority, conspiracy to commit child abuse, and several others. The evidence is overwhelming. Professor Dumbledore will be arrested within the next 48 hours. Harry found himself thinking about the man who had seemed so kind when he'd explained about Harry's parents, who had spoken so gently about love and sacrifice and the importance of choosing what was right over what was easy. The cognitive dissonance between that benevolent figure and the calculating manipulator described in these files was almost impossible to reconcile. "Did he ever care about me at all?" Harry asked, Or was it always just about what I could do for him? Bones looked at him with an expression of profound sympathy. Harry, I think Professor Dumbledore convinced himself that his actions were motivated by care for you and for the wizarding world. But the evidence suggests that any genuine concern for your welfare was always secondary to his strategic objectives. That's not care, McGonagall said fiercely. That's ownership. That's treating a child like a resource to be managed rather than a person to be protected. Harry absorbed this distinction, turning it over in his mind. The difference between being cared for and being managed was something he was only beginning to understand through his experiences with McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey and the other adults who had made his well-being a priority rather than a consideration to be balanced against other objectives. What happens to me now? He asked. I mean, if all of his plans are ruined and he's going to be arrested, what was I supposed to do about Voldemort? Harry, McGonagall said firmly, you are 11 years old. Your job is to go to school and learn magic and make friends and discover what kind of person you want to become. Whatever challenges the future may hold, they are not your responsibility to face alone, and certainly not your responsibility to face as a child. But what if— No, she interrupted with absolute conviction. There are no what-ifs that justify what was done to you. There are hundreds of adult witches and wizards whose job it is to protect magical children and fight dark wizards. You are not responsible for saving the world, Harry. You're responsible for healing from what was done to you and learning to live a life that brings you joy. The idea that his primary responsibility was his own healing and happiness rather than some grand destiny was so foreign that Harry wasn't sure how to respond to it. But looking at McGonagall's fierce expression, at the way she was defending his right to simply be a child, he felt something warm and unfamiliar begin to grow in his chest. For the first time in his life, he was being told that his own well-being mattered more than his utility to others. It was a radical concept, and one that would take time to fully accept. But sitting in the comfortable warmth of McGonagall's quarters, surrounded by adults who were genuinely outraged by what had been done to him, Harry began to believe that it might actually be true. "Will you still want to be my guardian?" he asked McGonagall, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "Even if I'm not. I mean, if I don't have to fight anyone or save anyone, will you still want me around?" The look she gave him was so fierce and loving that it took his breath away. "Harry Potter," she said, reaching over to take his hands in hers. "I didn't volunteer to be your guardian because of who your parents were or what you might accomplish in the future. I volunteered because you are a remarkable boy who deserves to be loved and protected for exactly who you are right now. Nothing will ever change that." As the afternoon wore on, and Bones continued to share the devastating evidence of Dumbledore's systematic betrayal, Harry found himself grieving not just for the childhood he had lost, but for the trust he had placed in someone who had viewed him as a tool rather than a person. But alongside the grief was something new, a growing understanding that he was surrounded by people who saw his worth in ways that had nothing to do with his fame or his destiny. He was learning to believe that he deserved better than he had received, and more importantly, that it was possible to heal from even the most profound betrayals when you were supported by people who truly cared about your well-being. The truth about Dumbledore's manipulation was devastating, but it was also liberating. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was free to discover who he might become when his own happiness was the priority, rather than an obstacle to be managed away. It was a freedom he intended to use well. Chapter 7. The Horcrux Revelation. The headaches had been getting worse. Harry noticed it first during his morning transfiguration session with McGonagall, a sharp stabbing pain behind his scar that made him wince and lose concentration just as he was successfully turning a matchstick into a needle, The pain was different from the dull ache he sometimes experienced when he was stressed or tired. This was more focused, more insistent, as though something inside his head was trying to break free. "Harry?" McGonagall's voice carried the kind of immediate concern that had become familiar over the past week. "What's wrong?" "Just a headache," Harry said automatically, touching his scar without thinking. "It's probably nothing." But McGonagall's sharp green eyes missed nothing, and she was already moving toward him with the purposeful stride that meant she had identified a problem that required immediate attention. "How long have you been having these headaches?" Harry tried to remember. The truth was that he'd had some level of headache for as long as he could recall, a constant low-grade pressure behind his scar that he'd simply accepted as normal. But these new episodes were different, sharper and more demanding of his attention. "A few days, maybe?" he said uncertainly. "But they're getting stronger, and they seem to happen when I'm doing magic, especially when I'm concentrating hard." McGonagall frowned, her hand moving to rest gently on his forehead in a gesture that was becoming wonderfully familiar. Her touch was cool and soothing, but Harry could see the worry in her expression. "We're going to see Madame Pomfrey," she declared. "Right now." "But the lesson—" "The lesson can wait," McGonagall said firmly. "Your health is more important than any academic schedule." The concept that his health was more important than meeting adult expectations was still revolutionary enough that Harry felt a warm flush of gratitude as they made their way to the hospital wing. At the Dursleys, illness had been treated as an inconvenience at best, evidence of weakness or attention-seeking at worst. The idea that adults might actually prioritize his physical comfort over their own convenience continued to amaze him. Madame Pomfrey took one look at Harry's face and immediately guided him to a bed, her experienced hands already reaching for diagnostic instruments. "Describe the pain," she said briskly, beginning the scanning spells that had become routine over the past week. "Sharp," Harry said, trying to find words for sensations he'd never had to articulate before. "Like something's pushing against the inside of my skull, and it's getting stronger when I do magic." Pomfrey's wand moved in increasingly complex patterns above his head, and Harry could see symbols and readings appearing in the air that he didn't understand. But he could read the growing concern in her expression as the diagnostic results accumulated. "Minerva," she said quietly, "I think we need some additional expertise." Within an hour, the hospital wing had filled with more magical specialists than Harry had ever seen in one place. There was a curse breaker from Gringotts, a specialist in dark magic from the Department of Mysteries, and most intimidatingly, a tall witch with silver hair who introduced herself as a specialist in soul magic and carried instruments that hummed with barely contained power. Harry lay on the hospital bed, feeling increasingly like a specimen under examination, as the various experts cast spell after spell, each one revealing new layers of magical complexity that seemed to concern them more with each discovery. "There's definitely something foreign in the scar tissue," the Cursebreaker said, consulting a device that looked like a cross between a telescope and a compass. "Something that doesn't belong to Mr. Potter's magical signature." "It's been there for years," the Department of Mysteries specialist added, her voice carefully neutral. "Possibly since the original injury was sustained." The soul magic specialist, Healer Lysander, she had introduced herself, was running the most complex diagnostics of all, her silver instruments casting colored lights that painted shifting patterns across Harry's skin. When she finally lowered her wand, her expression was grim. "Professor McGonagall," she said, "I need to speak with you privately." Harry watched as the adults moved to the far end of the hospital wing for a conversation that involved much pointing in his direction and what appeared to be increasingly heated discussion. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see the way McGonagall's face went progressively paler, the way Pomfrey's hands clenched into fists, the way the specialists kept looking at him with expressions that mixed professional concern with something that might have been horror. When they finally returned to his bedside, McGonagall's expression was carefully controlled in a way that made Harry's stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "Harry," she said, sitting down beside his bed and taking his hand in hers, "the specialists have identified what's been causing your headaches. There's a piece of foreign magic embedded in your scar, something that was placed there the night Voldemort tried to kill you." Harry felt the room seem to tilt slightly. "Foreign magic? A soul fragment," Healer Lysander said gently. "A piece of Tom Riddle's soul that attached itself to you when his curse rebounded. What's commonly known as a Horcrux." The words meant nothing to Harry, but he could tell from the adult's expressions that they meant something terrible. Is that bad?" "A Horcrux," McGonagall explained, her voice very careful, "is a piece of a wizard's soul that's been split off and attached to an object to prevent death. It's one of the darkest forms of magic known to wizard kind, and it's been living inside you for the past 10 years. Harry stared at her, trying to process this information. "You mean part of Voldemort is inside my head?" "A very small part," Pumphrey said quickly, "and it's been dormant for most of your life. But as your magical abilities strengthen and develop, it's beginning to cause problems. That's what's been causing your headaches. The foreign magic is incompatible with your own magical signature." "Can you get it out?" Harry asked, and he was proud that his voice remained steady, despite the sick fear that was spreading through his chest. "Yes," Healer Lysander said firmly. "It's a complex procedure, but it can be safely removed without harming you. However," she paused, exchanging glances with the other specialists, "there are some things you need to know first." McGonagall's grip on his hand tightened. "Harry, we've discovered that Professor Dumbledore has known about the Horcrux since your first year at Hogwarts." The familiar sensation of betrayal hit Harry like a physical blow. He knew. "The diagnostic spells that revealed it today are standard medical procedures," Pumphrey said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Any competent magical healer would have identified it within minutes. Professor Dumbledore had access to your medical records from your first day at Hogwarts." "Why didn't he tell me?" Harry asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "According to the files we discovered yesterday," McGonagall said, and Harry could hear the effort it was taking her to keep her voice level. "Professor Dumbledore believed that the only way to destroy the Horcrux was for the host to die." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the hospital wing. Harry felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest as he processed what McGonagall had just told him. "He was planning for me to die," Harry said quietly. "He knew that part of Voldemort was inside me, and instead of trying to remove it, he was planning for me to die, so it would die too." "Yes," McGonagall confirmed, and Harry could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "According to his notes, he believed that your death would be necessary to truly defeat Voldemort, and he saw no reason to tell you about the Horcrux, since it would only cause you distress without changing the ultimate outcome." Harry lay back against his pillows, trying to comprehend the scope of Dumbledore's betrayal. Not only had the man allowed him to be abused and isolated, he had known that Harry was carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul, and had planned all along for Harry to die to destroy it. The famous Harry Potter, the boy who lived, had been nothing more than a weapon to be aimed at the enemy and destroyed in the process. "He raised me like a sacrificial lamb," Harry said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. "Everything, the abuse, the isolation, keeping me ignorant about my situation, it was all to make sure I'd be willing to die when he decided it was time." "Harry," Healer Lysander interjected gently, "I want you to understand something very important. Professor Dumbledore was wrong about the necessity of your death. Advanced soul magic has developed significantly in recent years, and we have techniques for removing Horcruxes safely from living hosts. What was done to you, keeping you ignorant, planning for your death, was completely unnecessary." The information hit Harry like another physical blow. Not only had Dumbledore planned for his death, but that death wouldn't even have been necessary if he had consulted with actual experts in soul magic instead of making unilateral decisions based on incomplete information. "So I don't have to die," Harry said, needing to hear it confirmed. "You absolutely do not have to die," Lysander said firmly. "The procedure to remove the Horcrux is complex but safe. You'll be unconscious for the actual extraction, and you should feel significantly better once the foreign magic is removed from your system." "When can we do it?" McGonagall asked, and there was something fierce in her voice that suggested she wanted the piece of Voldemort removed from Harry as soon as magically possible. "We can begin preparations immediately," Lysander replied. "The procedure itself will take several hours, but with Mr. Potter's current state of health and the strength of his support system, I'm confident of a successful outcome." Over the next few hours, Harry found himself at the center of a whirlwind of magical preparation. Specialized healing potions were brewed, complex protective wards were established around the hospital wing, and additional specialists arrived to assist with what was apparently a groundbreaking procedure in the field of soul magic. Ron and Hermione were allowed to visit briefly before the procedure began, and their reaction to learning about the Horcrux was everything Harry could have hoped for from true friends. "That's the most disgusting thing I've ever heard," Ron declared with characteristic directness. "You know who put part of his soul inside your head? That's just wrong on every level." "It explains some things, though," Hermione said thoughtfully. "Your connection to Voldemort. The way you sometimes know things you shouldn't know. It must have been the Horcrux, creating a link between you." "And now it's going to be gone," Harry said, still marveling at the concept. "I'm going to be just me." "You were always just you," Hermione said firmly. "The Horcrux was never part of who you really are. It was just a parasite that's been making your life more difficult." The procedure itself was scheduled for the early evening, when the natural magical rhythms of the castle would be most conducive to complex soul magic. As the time approached, Harry found himself feeling nervous, but also oddly excited. The headaches that had plagued him for days were getting worse, but soon they would be gone forever. Soon he would be free of the last connection to Voldemort that he had never chosen. McGonagall stayed with him throughout the preparation, holding his hand and talking quietly about inconsequential things, upcoming lessons, books she thought he might enjoy, plans for the weekend. Her presence was soothing in a way that made Harry realize how much his capacity for trust had grown over the past week. He no longer felt the need to face difficult situations alone. "Professor McGonagall," he said, as Healer Lysander began the final preparations. "What happens after this? I mean, once the Horcrux is gone, what's my life supposed to be like?" She smiled at him, and it was one of those rare, completely unguarded expressions that made her look years younger. "Harry, once this is over, your life is going to be exactly what you make of it. You'll go to school, you'll learn magic, you'll spend time with your friends, and you'll discover what interests you and what makes you happy. You'll grow up to be whoever you choose to become, without anyone else deciding your fate for you." The idea of a future that he could actually choose, rather than one that had been predetermined by adults with their own agendas, was so appealing that Harry felt tears prick at his eyes. "Will you still want to be my guardian?" he asked. "Even if I'm not special anymore? Even if I don't have some grand destiny?" "Harry Potter," McGonagall said with fierce conviction, "you are not special because you have a piece of Voldemort's soul in your head. You're special because you're kind and brave and intelligent and capable of incredible loyalty and love. Those things are part of who you are, not what was done to you. And yes, I will absolutely still want to be your guardian. In fact, I suspect I'll like you even better without a Horcrux influencing your moods and giving you headaches." As Healer Lysander began the complex spellwork that would safely extract the soul fragment, Harry felt a profound sense of anticipation. For the first time in his life, he was about to be completely, entirely himself, free from Voldemort's influence, free from Dumbledore's machinations, free to discover who Harry Potter really was when no one else was trying to control or manipulate him. The procedure was less dramatic than Harry had expected. One moment he was lying on the hospital bed, surrounded by swirling magical energy, and the next he was waking up to sunshine streaming through the hospital wing windows, and the most incredible sensation of mental clarity he had ever experienced. The constant low-grade headache that had been part of his life for as long as he could remember was completely gone. More than that, he felt lighter somehow, as though a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted from his mind. The world seemed brighter, colors more vivid, and for the first time he could remember, his thoughts felt entirely his own. "How do you feel?" McGonagall asked, and Harry could see the relief in her expression as she noted his obvious improvement. "Amazing," Harry said, and meant it completely. "Like myself, but more so. Is that normal?" "Perfectly normal," Healer Lysander confirmed, consulting her instruments with obvious satisfaction. "The Horcrux was suppressing parts of your magical signature and influencing your emotional state. With it removed, you should experience significant improvements in both magical ability and general well-being." Over the next few days, Harry discovered that the healer's predictions were entirely accurate. His spellwork improved dramatically, his sleep was deeper and more restful, and most remarkably, he felt a sense of inner peace that he had never experienced before. He was still himself, still the boy who valued loyalty and friendship above all else, still quick to defend those who couldn't defend themselves, but now those qualities felt entirely his own, rather than reactions to trauma or external influence. The news of Dumbledore's arrest reached them 3 days later, delivered by Amelia Bones with the same professional composure she had maintained throughout the investigation. The charges were extensive: child endangerment, abuse of authority, conspiracy, and several violations of laws governing soul magic and medical ethics. "He's claiming he acted for the greater good," Bones reported. "He maintains that his actions, while regrettable, were necessary to ensure Voldemort's defeat." "And what's the Ministry's response to that defense?" McGonagall asked. "The Wizengamot has made it clear that the greater good does not excuse child abuse or medical malpractice," Bones replied firmly. "Professor Dumbledore will face the full consequences of his actions, regardless of his intentions or his past contributions to the wizarding world." Harry felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. There was satisfaction that justice was finally being served, but also a kind of sadness for the loss of the mentor figure he had briefly believed Dumbledore to be. Most of all, though, there was relief. The man who had shaped his life through manipulation and deliberate cruelty would no longer have any influence over his future. That evening, as Harry sat in McGonagall's quarters working on a charms essay, not because it was required, but because he was genuinely interested in the subject matter, he reflected on how much his life had changed in the space of just 2 weeks. He was free from the Dursleys' abuse, free from the Horcrux's influence, free from Dumbledore's manipulation. He had a guardian who cared about his well-being, friends who valued him for who he was rather than what he represented, and for the first time in his life, a future that was entirely his own to determine. The famous Harry Potter, the boy who lived, was finally free to discover who he really was, and that, Harry thought as he returned to his essay with a smile, was the greatest magic of all. Chapter 8. The Wizengamot Trial. The ancient courtroom of the Wizengamot had not seen such a packed gallery in living memory. Witches and wizards from across magical Britain had arrived before dawn to secure seats for what the Daily Prophet was calling the trial of the century. Though Harry Potter, sitting in the witness waiting area with Professor McGonagall, thought that description rather missed the point. This wasn't about spectacle or historical significance. This was about whether the wizarding world would finally hold one of its most powerful figures accountable for systematically abusing a child. Harry wore new robes that McGonagall had insisted upon purchasing for the occasion. not because his appearance mattered for legal purposes, she had explained, but because he deserved to feel confident and properly dressed when speaking his truth before the highest court in magical Britain. The robes were a deep green that complemented his eyes, well-tailored and comfortable, and wearing them made Harry feel older somehow, more substantial. Less like the frightened boy who had lived in a cupboard, and more like someone whose voice deserved to be heard. "How are you feeling?" McGonagall asked quietly, her hand resting on his shoulder, with the kind of steady reassurance that had become one of the most precious constants in his life. "Nervous," Harry admitted. "But also ready, I think. I want people to know what really happened. I want them to understand that what he did was wrong." McGonagall's expression was fierce with pride. "You're very brave, Harry. What you're doing today, telling your truth publicly, facing your abuser in front of the entire wizarding world, that takes a courage that most adults never develop." The waiting area was crowded with other witnesses who had been called to testify. Mrs. Fig sat in the corner looking older and more fragile than Harry remembered, her hands shaking slightly as she reviewed her testimony notes. Hagrid was there too, his massive frame hunched forward as he stared at the floor, occasionally wiping his eyes with a handkerchief the size of a small tablecloth. Several other figures Harry didn't recognize, ministry officials, medical experts, and what appeared to be other former students who had their own stories to tell about Dumbledore's manipulation. "Mr. Potter." A ministry clerk appeared at Harry's elbow, his official robes pristine, and his expression professionally neutral. "Chief Warlock Bagnold is ready for your testimony." Harry stood, smoothing down his robes automatically, and followed the clerk through a heavy oak door into the courtroom itself. The sight that greeted him was both overwhelming and oddly reassuring. The circular chamber was packed with people, hundreds of witches and wizards filling every available seat, their faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from sympathy to outrage to intense curiosity. But in the center of it all was the dock where Albus Dumbledore sat, looking older and smaller than Harry remembered, his usually twinkling eyes now dull and resigned. For a moment, Harry felt the familiar flutter of intimidation that had characterized his interactions with the former headmaster. But then he remembered the Horcrux removal, the clarity that had come with understanding that his thoughts and feelings were entirely his own, and the intimidation faded. This was not his mentor or authority figure. This was simply a man who had made terrible choices and was finally being held accountable for them. "Mr. Potter," Chief Warlock Bagnold said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "please state your full name and age for the record." "Harry James Potter," Harry said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. 11 years old. "Mr. Potter, you are appearing today as a victim and witness in the case against Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, who stands accused of multiple counts of child endangerment, abuse of authority, medical malpractice, and conspiracy. Do you understand why you've been called to testify?" "Yes," Harry replied. "To tell the truth about what Professor Dumbledore knew about my treatment and what he chose to do about it." Prosecutor Amelia Bones stood to begin the examination, her presence commanding and authoritative in a way that made Harry feel protected rather than intimidated. She had spent hours with him over the past week, explaining what the trial would involve and helping him prepare for what she warned would be difficult questions from both sides. "Mr. Potter," Bones began, "please tell the court about your living situation from the time you were 15 months old until you arrived at Hogwarts." Harry took a deep breath and began the story he had told so many times now, first to Madame Pomfrey, then to Kingsley Shacklebolt, then to various ministry investigators, and finally to the team of prosecutors who were handling the case. But this time felt different. This time he was telling it publicly, officially, with the entire wizarding world listening. He described the cupboard under the stairs, the irregular meals, the periods of punishment when he was locked away for days without food or water. He explained about Dudley's games and Uncle Vernon's rages, about the broken bones that were never treated, and the constant fear that had shaped his childhood. As he spoke, he could see the reactions rippling through the gallery, gasps of horror, angry murmurs, and more than a few people wiping their eyes. "Mr. Potter," Bones continued when he had finished describing his living conditions, "were you ever visited by social services or other officials who might have assessed your welfare?" "No," Harry said. "But Mrs. Figg was always around. I thought she was just a neighbour, but I found out later that she was watching me and reporting back to Professor Dumbledore." "And what did Mrs. Figg observe during her surveillance?" Harry looked toward the witness section where Mrs. Figg sat, her face pale with guilt and distress. "She saw the bruises. She saw when I hadn't been fed. She saw when I couldn't use my arm properly for weeks after it was hurt. She asked Professor Dumbledore for permission to help me, and he told her not to interfere." The angry murmur from the gallery was louder this time, and Chief Warlock Bagnold had to call for order. Harry could see several members of the Wizengamot exchanging shocked looks, and a few were taking extensive notes. "Mr. Potter," Bones said, "are you aware that Professor Dumbledore received detailed reports about your mistreatment throughout your childhood?" "Yes," Harry replied. "I've seen some of the reports. Mrs. Figg documented everything. The violence, the neglect, the times when I was locked away. She told Professor Dumbledore about all of it, and he told her it was necessary for my character development." This statement prompted such an uproar from the gallery that Bagnold had to threaten to clear the courtroom before order could be restored. Harry used the interruption to glance at Dumbledore, who was staring at his hands and looked older and more fragile than Harry had ever seen him. "Mr. Potter," Bones continued, "are you also aware that Professor Dumbledore knew about the soul fragment, the Horcrux, that was embedded in your scar?" "Yes," Harry said. "He knew about it from my first year at Hogwarts, maybe earlier. But instead of having it removed, he planned for me to die so that it would be destroyed along with me." The gasps from the gallery were audible this time, and Harry could see several people in the front rows leaning forward as though they couldn't believe what they were hearing. "Can you explain what you mean by that, Mr. Potter?" Harry felt McGonagall's presence in the family section and drew strength from her supportive expression. Professor Dumbledore believed that the only way to destroy the Horcrux was for the host to die. So he made sure I would be willing to sacrifice myself when the time came. That's why he allowed the abuse. He said it would teach me humility and make me less attached to life. The courtroom erupted. Angry shouts filled the air. Several people stood from their seats gesturing furiously, and Chief Warlock Bagnold had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore any semblance of order. When the noise finally subsided, Harry could see that many members of the Wizengamot looked genuinely shaken by what they had heard. "Mr. Potter," Bones said, her voice carrying clearly in the relative quiet, "do you believe that Professor Dumbledore cared about your welfare?" Harry considered the question carefully. It was one that had haunted him since learning the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulation. "I think Professor Dumbledore cared about the part of me that was useful to him, but he didn't care about me as a person. If he had, he would have tried to find a way to remove the Horcrux without planning for my death. He would have made sure I was safe and happy instead of deliberately allowing me to be hurt." "Thank you, Mr. Potter. No further questions." Dumbledore's defense attorney, a thin, nervous-looking wizard named Percival Clearwater, rose for cross-examination with obvious reluctance. His strategy, it quickly became clear, was to paint Dumbledore's actions as regrettable but necessary wartime decisions made under enormous pressure. "Mr. Potter," Clearwater began, "you've described a difficult childhood, but surely you understand that Professor Dumbledore was acting in what he believed to be the best interests of the wizarding world." "I understand that's what he told himself," Harry replied, "but I don't think allowing children to be abused is ever in anyone's best interests, even during wartime. But consider the alternative," Clearwater pressed. If Professor Dumbledore had removed you from your relative's home, you would have grown up in the wizarding world, possibly developing an inflated sense of your own importance. Wouldn't that have made you less suitable for the role you were destined to play? Harry felt a flash of anger at the question, but McGonagall had prepared him for this line of attack. "I wasn't destined to play any role," he said clearly. "I was a child who deserved to be safe and cared for. No one had the right to decide that my suffering was acceptable for some greater purpose." "But surely—" "And besides," Harry interrupted, feeling his confidence growing, "Professor Dumbledore was wrong about the Horcrux. The soul magic specialists were able to remove it safely without anyone dying. So all that suffering was for nothing. It was based on incomplete information, and his refusal to consult with actual experts." The defense attorney looked flustered by this response, and his subsequent questions became increasingly desperate attempts to justify the unjustifiable. By the time he finished his cross-examination, he had accomplished little beyond making Dumbledore look even worse to the assembled court. The next witness was Madame Pumphrey, whose medical testimony was devastating in its clinical precision. She presented the magical scans that had revealed the extent of Harry's injuries, explained the evidence of chronic malnutrition and magical suppression, and described the healing protocols that had been necessary to address years of neglect. "In your professional opinion," Bones asked, "was Mr. Potter's treatment medically justifiable under any circumstances?" "Absolutely not," Pumphrey replied firmly. "The level of abuse documented in these scans would be considered criminal under any circumstances. No medical or psychological theory supports deliberately subjecting children to malnutrition and physical violence. Were you aware of Mr. Potter's condition during his years at Hogwarts?" "I was not," Pumphrey said, and Harry could hear the guilt in her voice. "Professor Dumbledore assured me that Mr. Potter's summer care was adequate and that detailed medical monitoring was unnecessary. I deeply regret not conducting more thorough examinations despite his assurances." Mrs. Figg's testimony was perhaps the most emotionally difficult to hear. The elderly squib took the witness stand with visible reluctance, her voice shaking as she described years of watching Harry's mistreatment and being explicitly ordered not to intervene. "I begged him," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I showed Professor Dumbledore the photographs I'd taken of Harry's bruises, told him about the boy crying himself to sleep in the garden shed when he was locked out of the house. I offered to take Harry in myself, to provide him with proper care. But Professor Dumbledore insisted that any intervention would interfere with the protective magic and jeopardize Harry's safety from you-know-who." "Did you believe Professor Dumbledore's explanations?" Bones asked gently. "I wanted to," Mrs. Figg replied. "He was the leader of the Order of the Phoenix, the most respected wizard in Britain. When he told me that Harry's suffering was necessary to keep him safe from dark wizards, I convinced myself it was true. But I never stopped feeling guilty about it, and I never stopped documenting what I saw in case someday someone would listen." Hagrid's testimony was brief but emotionally powerful. The groundskeeper could barely speak through his tears as he described collecting baby Harry from the ruins of Godric's Hollow and delivering him to Privet Drive on Dumbledore's orders. "I trusted him," Hagrid said simply. "Professor Dumbledore told me it was the best place for Harry, that he'd be loved and cared for. If I'd known, if I'd had any idea what they'd do to that little boy." The most damaging testimony, however, came from several former students who had been called as witnesses to establish a pattern of manipulation and endangerment. Neville Longbottom's grandmother testified about Dumbledore's refusal to provide additional security for Frank and Alice Longbottom, despite knowing they were being targeted by Death Eaters. A former Slytherin student described how Dumbledore had used information about his Death Eater father to pressure him into dangerous spying activities during his 6th year. Professor Dumbledore presented these situations as opportunities for the students to prove themselves, the former Slytherin testified. But looking back, It's clear that he was systematically placing children in dangerous situations to serve his strategic objectives. When it came time for Dumbledore himself to testify, the courtroom fell completely silent. The former headmaster rose slowly from the dock, looking every one of his many years, and took the witness stand with what appeared to be great effort. His defense was exactly what Harry had expected: a careful explanation of wartime necessities, greater good calculations, and the regrettable but unavoidable nature of the choices he had made. He spoke eloquently about the protection the Blood Wards had provided, about the danger Harry would have faced if his location had become known to Voldemort's followers, about the character-building value of adversity. But when Amelia Bones rose for cross-examination, the inadequacy of these justifications became painfully apparent. "Professor Dumbledore," she began, "you've testified that Mr. Potter's placement with his relatives was necessary for his protection. Are you aware that multiple safe houses were available through the Ministry's Witness Protection Program?" "I believed the blood protection to be superior." "Are you also aware that the blood protection magic could have been maintained while providing Mr. Potter with adequate food, shelter, and medical care?" "The Dursleys were instructed—" "Professor Dumbledore," Bones interrupted, her voice growing sharper, "did you or did you not receive detailed reports documenting Mr. Potter's abuse throughout his childhood?" Dumbledore was silent for a long moment. "I received reports, yes." "And did those reports document instances of physical violence, deliberate starvation, and extended periods of isolation?" "The reports. There were incidents, yes, but I believed—" "Did you take any action to protect Mr. Potter from these incidents?" Another long silence. "I believed that intervention would compromise his safety. So your answer is no. You took no action to protect a child who was being systematically abused under your authority?" "I made the best decisions I could under extraordinarily difficult circumstances." "Professor Dumbledore," Bones said, producing a thick file from her podium, "these are your own surveillance notes on Mr. Potter's development. In them you describe his satisfactory progress toward accepting personal sacrifice for the greater good. Can you explain what you meant by that?" Dumbledore's face had gone very pale. "Miss Bones, I'm afraid you're taking my notes out of context. I'm reading your exact words, Professor. You also wrote, and I quote, 'The boy's attachment to life remains troublingly strong. Additional hardship may be necessary to prepare him for his ultimate sacrifice.' Do you deny writing those words?" The courtroom was completely silent now, and Harry could see the horror on the faces of the Wizengamot members as the full scope of Dumbledore's manipulation was revealed. Dumbledore began, then stopped. For the first time since Harry had known him, the great Albus Dumbledore seemed to have run out of words. "No further questions," Bones said quietly. The closing arguments were anticlimactic after the devastating testimony that had preceded them. Dumbledore's attorney made a final, desperate attempt to frame his client's actions as misguided but well-intentioned wartime decisions. Bones delivered a powerful summation that focused on the fundamental principle that no cause, however noble, could justify the systematic abuse of children. "Members of the Wizengamot," she concluded, "you have heard evidence of a decade-long conspiracy to abuse and manipulate a child in service of one man's strategic objectives. Professor Dumbledore had numerous alternatives available to him: safe houses, foster families, magical protection that did not require suffering. He chose instead to allow and actively orchestrate the systematic abuse of Harry Potter because he believed it would make the boy more willing to die when called upon to do so. This is not wartime necessity. This is not the greater good. This is the calculated abuse of power, and it demands the strongest possible response from this court." The Wizengamot deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week, but Chief Warlock Bagnold made it clear that Dumbledore would remain in custody pending sentencing, with no possibility of bail. As the courtroom emptied and reporters rushed to file their stories, Harry sat quietly in the witness section, feeling strangely peaceful. It was over. The truth had been told, justice had been served, and the wizarding world now understood that even their greatest heroes could fall when they lost sight of basic human decency. "How do you feel?" McGonagall asked, as they prepared to leave the courthouse. "Free," Harry said, and realized with surprise that it was completely true. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely free." The trial of Albus Dumbledore would be remembered as a turning point in wizarding society, the moment when the magical community finally reckoned with the consequences of placing hero worship above accountability. But for Harry Potter, it was something much simpler and more personal. It was the day he reclaimed his own story. Chapter 9. Consequences and Accountability. The sentencing hearing took place exactly 1 week after the guilty verdict, though the outcome had been largely predetermined by the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the public outcry that had followed the trial. Harry sat in the witness section of the Wizengamot chamber, watching as Albus Dumbledore was led into the dock for the final time, and felt a complex mixture of emotions that he was still learning to understand and accept. There was satisfaction, certainly, a sense that justice was finally being served after years of suffering in silence. But there was also something that might have been sadness, though not for Dumbledore himself, so much as for the mentor figure Harry had briefly believed him to be. The man who stood before the court now, stripped of his titles and honors, looked every inch of his considerable age and bore little resemblance to the wise, benevolent headmaster of Harry's brief acquaintance. Chief Warlock Bagnold read the charges and convictions with the formal precision that such proceedings demanded, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. The list was extensive. Multiple counts of child endangerment, abuse of authority, medical malpractice, conspiracy to commit child abuse, and violations of magical child protection statutes that dated back centuries. "Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore," she continued, "you have been found guilty by this court of systematically orchestrating and perpetuating the abuse of Harry James Potter over a period of 10 years. You have been found guilty of placing your own strategic objectives above the welfare and safety of a child under your protection. You have been found guilty of manipulating magical guardianship laws to serve your personal agenda rather than the best interests of the child in question." The courtroom was completely silent as Bagnold paused to consult her notes. When she resumed speaking, her voice carried the weight of institutional authority that had been centuries in the making. "These crimes represent not merely individual failures of judgment, but a systematic abuse of the power and trust that magical society placed in your hands. Your actions have caused immeasurable harm not only to Mr. Potter, but to the integrity of our institutions and the public's faith in those we entrust with positions of authority." Harry found himself studying Dumbledore's face as the Chief Warlock spoke, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding of the gravity of his crimes. But the former headmaster's expression remained largely impassive, as though he were listening to someone discuss events that had happened to other people entirely. "The sentence of this court," Bagnold concluded, "is 25 years imprisonment in Azkaban, with the possibility of parole after 15 years contingent on demonstrated rehabilitation and a full public accounting of your crimes. Additionally, you are hereby stripped of all orders, honors, and titles previously granted by magical institutions. Your name will be removed from positions of trust, your portraits will be taken down from places of honor, and you are permanently banned from any professional involvement with magical children." The pronouncement of sentence was met not with the dramatic outburst Harry had half expected, but with a kind of collective exhale from the gallery, as though the assembled crowd had been holding its breath throughout the proceedings. Justice had been served, formally and completely, and there was a sense of closure that Harry found surprisingly peaceful. As Dumbledore was led away to begin his sentence, looking older and more fragile with each step, Harry felt McGonagall's hand rest gently on his shoulder. "How are you feeling?" she asked quietly. Relieved, Harry said, and realized with some surprise that it was true. I thought I might feel guilty about sending him to Azkaban, but I don't. What he did was wrong, and there have to be consequences for that. Otherwise, how can we trust that other children will be protected? McGonagall's smile was fierce with pride. You've learned something that many adults never understand, Harry. Accountability isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring that harm doesn't happen again. The aftermath of the trial extended far beyond the courtroom itself. Within days of the sentencing, the Ministry of Magic had announced the most comprehensive reforms to child protection procedures in the history of magical Britain. A new Department of Magical Child Welfare was established with emergency funding and broad investigative powers. Mandatory reporting requirements were implemented for all magical educators and healthcare providers. Background checks became required for anyone seeking guardianship of magical children, and regular home visits were mandated for all non-traditional placements. Harry learned about these reforms through the steady stream of ministry officials who visited him in the weeks following the trial, not to question him further, but to explain the changes that were being implemented in response to his case, and to seek his input on policies designed to protect other vulnerable children. Mr. Potter, said Delphine Clearwater, the newly appointed head of the Department of Magical Child Welfare, the ministry recognizes that institutional failures enabled your abuse to continue for far too long. We want to ensure that no other magical child suffers as you suffered, and we believe your perspective as a survivor is invaluable in designing effective protection systems. Harry sat in McGonagall's comfortable sitting room, surrounded by the domestic warmth that had become his new normal, and considered this request carefully. The idea that his experiences could be used to help other children was both appealing and daunting. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he said. "Nothing that would interfere with your education or recovery," Clearwater assured him. "But we're forming advisory committees to review existing policies and recommend improvements. We'd like you to serve on the committee that addresses detection and intervention protocols, helping us understand what signs adults should watch for and how children can be encouraged to report mistreatment." McGonagall leaned forward in her chair. "Harry, you don't need to make this decision immediately. Take time to think about whether you feel ready for that kind of responsibility." But Harry found that he didn't need time to consider it. "I want to help," he said firmly. "I know what it's like to suffer in silence, because adults aren't paying attention or don't care enough to act. If my experience can help prevent that for other children, then I want to be involved." The reforms weren't limited to new policies and procedures. Hogwarts itself underwent significant changes in the weeks following the trial. The Board of Governors conducted a complete review of student welfare protocols, implementing new systems for monitoring student health and well-being. Mandatory training was established for all faculty on recognizing signs of abuse and neglect. Most significantly, the position of student advocate was created, an independent adult whose sole responsibility was to ensure that student welfare concerns were properly addressed without interference from administrative priorities. Harry watched these changes unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and wonder. The idea that his suffering might be the catalyst for creating a safer environment for future generations of magical children was both humbling and empowering. He was learning that there was meaning to be found in even the darkest experiences if they could be used to prevent others from enduring similar harm. The public response to the trial had been equally dramatic. The Daily Prophet ran a series of investigative articles examining how such systematic abuse could have been overlooked by so many institutions for so long. Public hearings were held to review the performance of various oversight bodies. Several high-ranking ministry officials who had been aware of irregularities in Harry's situation but had failed to act lost their positions. Most personally meaningful to Harry, however, was the formal apology issued by Minister Fudge on behalf of the magical government. "Mr. Harry Potter was failed by our institutions, our laws, and our collective responsibility to protect magical children. The systematic abuse he endured was enabled by bureaucratic indifference, misplaced deference to authority, and a failure to prioritize child welfare over political considerations. On behalf of the Ministry of Magic and the entire magical community, I offer our deepest apologies to Mr. Potter and our solemn promise that such failures will never again be permitted to occur. The apology was accompanied by a substantial monetary settlement, not as compensation for what Harry had endured, which everyone acknowledged could never be adequately compensated, but as a gesture of institutional accountability and a fund to support his future education and any therapeutic needs he might have. "You don't have to accept it if you don't want to," McGonagall had explained when the offer was first presented. "The money doesn't erase what happened to you, and you're under no obligation to make the Ministry feel better about their failures by accepting their gesture." But Harry had found the formal acknowledgement of institutional failure surprisingly meaningful. "It's not about the money," he said. "It's about them admitting that what happened to me was their responsibility too, not just Dumbledore's or the Dursleys. If other adults and institutions had done their jobs properly, I wouldn't have suffered for 10 years. The settlement funds were placed in a trust that would support his education through university and beyond. But Harry had already begun thinking about how some of it might be used to support the advocacy work he was becoming increasingly committed to. Perhaps most remarkably, Harry found that his relationship with his peers at Hogwarts had been strengthened rather than complicated by the public revelation of his abuse. Ron and Hermione had rallied around him with the fierce loyalty he was learning to expect from true friends, and other students had approached him with stories of their own. Not abuse on the scale he had endured, but smaller instances of being overlooked or dismissed by adults who should have been protective. "You've made it easier for all of us to speak up," a third-year Hufflepuff named Susan Bones told him one afternoon in the library. "When you testified in court, when you talked about how adults should believe children and take them seriously, it made me realize that I didn't have to just accept it when my guardian dismisses my concerns about my younger cousin's treatment." Harry was learning that his courage in speaking publicly about his abuse had created space for other young people to find their own voices, to recognize that they deserved to be heard and protected. It was a responsibility he hadn't expected, but was determined to honor. The changes at Hogwarts extended to the teaching staff as well. Several professors who had been aware of irregularities in Harry's situation, but had deferred to Dumbledore's authority, underwent additional training on mandatory reporting and child advocacy. Professor Snape, who had struggled visibly with the revelation that his hatred of Harry's father had blinded him to Harry's suffering, requested a transfer to another position rather than continue teaching children he felt he had failed to protect. "I cannot undo my failure to see what was happening to you," he said in a stilted conversation with Harry shortly before his departure. "But I can ensure that my personal prejudices never again interfere with my responsibility to protect students under my care." Harry had accepted this acknowledgement with the same grace he was learning to apply to all the complicated emotions surrounding his case. Holding on to anger and resentment served no constructive purpose, but neither did he feel obligated to offer forgiveness to those who hadn't earned it. The most significant change, however, was in Harry himself, the boy who had arrived at Hogwarts just weeks ago, frightened, isolated, convinced that he deserved whatever treatment he received, had been transformed by the experience of being believed, protected, and valued by adults who prioritized his well-being. He was discovering a sense of confidence and agency that felt entirely new, a belief in his own worth that wasn't dependent on his famous name or his role in defeating dark wizards. "You've grown so much," McGonagall observed one evening as they sat together working on their respective reading. She grading essays, he working through a fascinating text on magical theory that Professor Flitwick had recommended. "I feel different," Harry agreed. "More like myself, if that makes sense. Like I'm finally discovering who I really am when I'm not scared all the time." "And who is that?" McGonagall asked with gentle curiosity. Harry considered the question carefully. "Someone who cares about fairness. Someone who wants to help people who can't help themselves. Someone who believes that children deserve to be safe and protected, and who's willing to work to make that happen. It was a far cry from the destiny of heroic sacrifice that Dumbledore had planned for him, but it felt infinitely more authentic and sustainable. Harry Potter was discovering that he could be a force for positive change in the world without being a weapon pointed at dark wizards, and that the most meaningful battles were often fought in courtrooms and committee meetings rather than on battlefield. As autumn deepened into winter, and Harry settled more fully into his new life, he found himself thinking less about what had been done to him and more about what he might accomplish going forward. The past would always be part of his story, but it no longer defined his future. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was free to write his own story, and he intended to make it one of healing, advocacy, and hope. The wizarding world had failed him once, but with his help, it would be better prepared to protect the vulnerable children who came after him. That seemed like a legacy worth building. Chapter 10. New Foundations. The formal adoption proceedings took place on a crisp December morning in the Ministry's Department of Magical Families, in a chamber that was designed to feel welcoming rather than intimidating. Sunlight streamed through tall windows that overlooked the atrium, and the walls were decorated with moving photographs of families celebrating adoption ceremonies, witches and wizards of all ages embracing children who had found their forever homes through the magical legal system. Harry sat beside McGonagall at a polished oak table, wearing the deep blue dress robes she had helped him select for the occasion. They were the first formal robes that had ever been purchased specifically for him, tailored to fit his slight frame perfectly, and wearing them made him feel older and more substantial somehow. More like someone whose choices and preferences mattered in the world. "How are you feeling?" McGonagall asked quietly, her own formal robes a deep emerald green that complemented her eyes and lent her an air of dignified authority. "Happy," Harry said, and realized with some surprise that the word felt entirely accurate. "Nervous, maybe, but mostly happy. I've never been officially wanted before." McGonagall's smile was soft and fierce at the same time. "You've been wanted since the day I met you, Harry. Today we're simply making it legal." The family court magistrate, a kindly-looking witch named Magistrate Clearwater, reviewed the extensive documentation that had been prepared for the adoption. Harry's consent to the proceedings, McGonagall's guardianship application, character references from colleagues and friends, financial statements demonstrating her ability to provide for Harry's needs, and most importantly, the psychological evaluations that confirmed the strength of their emotional bond and the positive impact of their relationship on Harry's recovery. "Professor McGonagall," Magistrate Clearwater began, "you've served as Mr. Potter's temporary guardian for several months now. Can you tell the court why you wish to formalize this arrangement through adoption?" McGonagall straightened in her chair, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of conviction that left no room for doubt. "Your Honor, Harry has become far more than a student under my temporary care. He is the child of my heart, and I love him as completely as if I had given birth to him myself. I want him to have the legal security of knowing that our family bond is permanent and unbreakable, regardless of what challenges the future might bring. And Mr. Potter," the magistrate continued, turning to Harry with the kind of respectful attention that still amazed him when it came from adults. "Do you wish Professor McGonagall to become your legal guardian through adoption?" "Yes," Harry said, his voice steady and clear. "Professor McGonagall is the first adult who ever made me feel safe and valued. She's taught me what family really means, and I want that to be official. I want to be her son." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, and Harry saw tears spring to McGonagall's eyes despite her obvious efforts to maintain her composure. "Mr. Potter," Magistrate Clearwater said gently, "adoption creates a permanent legal relationship that cannot be dissolved except under extraordinary circumstances. Do you understand that if Professor McGonagall becomes your adoptive mother, she will have both the rights and responsibilities of a parent for the rest of your life?" "I understand," Harry replied. "And I want that. I want to belong to a family that chose me and values me, instead of one that saw me as a burden." The legal ceremony itself was surprisingly brief. Magistrate Clearwater reviewed the final paperwork, confirmed that all requirements had been met, and signed the adoption decree with a flourish that seemed appropriately momentous. But what followed was far more meaningful than any official documentation. McGonagall reached over and took Harry's hands in hers, her usually steady voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Harry James Potter McGonagall," she said, testing out the name they had chosen together. "I promise you that you will always have a home with me, always have someone who loves you unconditionally, and always have an advocate who will fight for your best interests. You are my son now, officially and forever." Harry felt tears spill over, despite his efforts to maintain his composure, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Thank you," he whispered, "for choosing me, for wanting me, for showing me what it means to be part of a real family." The celebration that followed the adoption ceremony was everything Harry had never known to dream of. McGonagall had arranged for a small gathering in her quarters that evening, and the guest list read like a catalogue of every adult who had shown him genuine care and support over the past months. Hagrid arrived with a cake that was only slightly lopsided, and a gift that turned out to be a beautifully carved photo frame designed to hold pictures that would never fade. "For your family photos," he said gruffly, wiping his eyes with his enormous handkerchief. "Every family needs proper photos." Madame Pumphrey brought a medical kit enchanted specifically for Harry's ongoing health needs, but more importantly, she brought a hug that conveyed all her maternal pride in his recovery and growth. "You look so healthy," she said, studying his face with professional satisfaction. "So much stronger than when you first arrived here." Professor Flitwick presented Harry with a collection of advanced magical texts selected specifically for his interests and abilities. "I've never had a student show such natural aptitude for theoretical magic," he said with obvious pride. "These books will challenge you in all the best ways." Even Amelia Bones attended, bringing not only official congratulations from the ministry, but also a personal gift, a photograph of Harry's parents on their wedding day, recovered from ministry archives and professionally restored. "Every child deserves to know where they came from," she said, as Harry stared at the image of his young parents, looking radiantly happy. "Your mother and father would be so proud of the young man you're becoming." But perhaps the most meaningful guests were Ron and Hermione, whose friendship had become one of the anchors of Harry's new life. They arrived together, bearing gifts that showed how well they had come to know him over the months of his recovery. Ron brought a collection of wizards' chess sets from around the world, including one from his own family that had been passed down through generations. "Mum insisted," he said, his ears red with embarrassment. "She says you're family now, and family shares the important stuff." Hermione's gift was more personal, a leather-bound journal with pages that would preserve whatever was written on them indefinitely. "I thought you might want to record your thoughts and experiences," she explained. "For yourself, but also maybe someday for other children who might need to know that survival and recovery are possible." As the evening progressed, and the small gathering settled into comfortable conversation, Harry found himself observing the scene with a kind of amazed gratitude. This was his family now, not the relatives he had been born to or assigned to, but the adults and friends who had chosen to love and support him. The warmth of their affection was palpable in the room, surrounding him with a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. "Speech!" Hagrid called out at one point, raising his cup of tea in Harry's direction. "The guest of honor should say something." Harry stood, feeling suddenly self-conscious, but also eager to express what this moment meant to him. "I used to think that family was just something that happened to you," he began, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "Something you were stuck with, whether it was good for you or not. But I've learned that real family is about choice, People choosing to love you and care for you and fight for your well-being, even when it's difficult or inconvenient. He looked around the room at the faces turned toward him with such obvious affection and attention. All of you chose to see me as worth protecting and caring about when I couldn't see it myself. You chose to believe me when I finally found the courage to tell the truth about my life. And now I get to choose you back, officially and permanently. He raised his own cup, his hand steady despite the emotion in his voice. To chosen family, and to all the people who prove that love is an action, not just a feeling. The toast that followed was accompanied by more than a few tears, and Harry realized that this was what happiness felt like. Not the brief, anxious pleasure he had sometimes experienced at the Dursleys when he managed to avoid punishment, but a deep, settled sense of belonging and security that he could trust to last. The weeks that followed the adoption were marked by a series of smaller but equally meaningful developments. Harry's academic performance, which had always been limited by the chaos and fear of his home life, improved dramatically as he discovered what it meant to learn in an environment where his success was genuinely wanted and supported. His essays grew longer and more thoughtful as he gained confidence in his own ideas. His magical practical work became more sophisticated as he learned to trust his instincts and take intellectual risks. Most remarkably, he began to show genuine enthusiasm for subjects that interested him, rather than simply trying to avoid the negative attention that came with poor performance. "Your transfiguration work has become quite remarkable," McGonagall observed one afternoon as she reviewed his latest assignment. "The theoretical framework you've developed for understanding cross-species transformation is advanced enough for a sixth-year student." "I like the logic of it," Harry said, looking up from the advanced text he was reading for his own interest, rather than because it was assigned. "The way the magic responds to intention and understanding rather than just memorized movements, it makes sense in a way that other subjects sometimes don't." "Have you given any thought to what you might like to study after Hogwarts?" McGonagall asked, settling into the chair across from him with her own reading. "It's early yet, of course, but it's never too soon to begin thinking about your interests and goals." It was a question that would have been impossible for Harry to answer just months before, when his future had been determined entirely by other people's agendas and expectations. But now, with the security of a loving family and the freedom to make his own choices, he found himself genuinely excited about the possibilities ahead. "I think I might want to study magical law," he said thoughtfully. "Specifically laws relating to children's rights and protection. I want to understand how the legal system works, so I can help make it better at protecting vulnerable people." McGonagall's smile was radiant with pride. "That sounds like a perfect fit for your interests and values. And with your experience and perspective, you could make real contributions to reforming systems that clearly need improvement." Harry's friendships, too, had deepened and developed as he learned to trust that people could care about him without wanting something in return. Ron and Hermione had become not just his closest friends, but genuine confidants who knew his complete story and loved him, not despite his history, but as part of the complete person he was becoming. "You know," Hermione said one evening, as they sat together in the Gryffindor common room working on their respective essays, "you're completely different from when you first arrived at Hogwarts." "Different how?" Harry asked, looking up from his Defense Against the Dark Arts assignment. "Happier, obviously," Ron said, not looking up from the chess problem he was working through. "But also more confident. More like you know you belong here. You speak up more in class," Hermione added. "You ask questions when you don't understand something, instead of just trying to hide. And you actually argue with us sometimes, instead of just agreeing with whatever we say." Harry considered this observation. It was true that he had learned to express his own opinions and preferences, instead of simply trying to please the people around him. The change had been gradual but profound, a growing understanding that his thoughts and feelings mattered, that relationships were stronger when they were based on honest communication rather than fearful compliance. "I think I'm learning what it means to be myself," he said finally. "I spent so many years trying to be invisible, or trying to be what other people wanted me to be, that I never really figured out who I actually was. Now I get to discover that." One of the most important developments in Harry's recovery was the introduction of regular counseling sessions with a specialist in magical trauma therapy. Healer Miranda Vance came to Hogwarts twice a week to work with Harry on processing his experiences and developing healthy coping strategies. Recovery from childhood trauma isn't just about addressing the immediate physical and emotional damage, she explained during one of their early sessions. It's about learning new patterns of thinking and relating that help you build a healthy life going forward. The therapy sessions were difficult sometimes, particularly when they involved discussing specific incidents from his childhood or exploring the complex emotions he felt about his abusers. But Harry found that having a safe space to process these feelings with a trained professional helped him understand his experiences in ways that reduced their power to hurt him. "I used to think I was responsible for what happened to me," he told Healer Vance during one session, "like if I had just been better or different somehow. They wouldn't have hurt me." "That's a very common response to childhood abuse," she replied gently. "Children naturally assume that they have control over their environment, so when bad things happen, they often conclude that they must have caused them somehow. But understanding intellectually that abuse is never the child's fault, and really believing it emotionally, are two different things." Through their work together, Harry learned to recognize and challenge the negative thought patterns that had been ingrained by years of mistreatment. He practiced setting boundaries, expressing his needs clearly, and trusting his own judgment about people and situations. Most importantly, he learned to see his survival and recovery as evidence of his strength rather than proof of his inadequacy. Perhaps most meaningfully, Harry began sharing his story with other young people who had experienced similar trauma. The Department of Magical Child Welfare had established support groups for magical children who had been removed from abusive situations, and Harry volunteered to speak at their meetings about his own experiences and recovery. "The hardest part for me," he told a group of children ranging in age from 8 to 15, "was learning to believe that I deserved better treatment. I had been told for so long that I was worthless or a burden that I couldn't imagine adults actually wanting to care for me." A 10-year-old witch named Lucy raised her hand tentatively. "How did you learn to trust the good adults? I'm scared that the people taking care of me now are just pretending to be nice and will turn mean later." Harry smiled at her with genuine understanding. "That's a really smart question, and being cautious about trusting adults who have authority over you is actually a good thing. But I learned to tell the difference between adults who really care and adults who are just going through the motions by watching what they do, not just what they say." He went on to explain how McGonagall had proven her care through consistent actions, prioritizing his comfort, asking for his opinions, keeping her promises, and advocating for his needs even when it was inconvenient for her. "Good adults don't get angry when you have feelings or needs," he continued. "They don't punish you for things you can't control, and they don't make you feel like their love depends on you being perfect all the time." These conversations with other young survivors became one of the most meaningful aspects of Harry's recovery, helping other children understand that healing was possible, that they deserved love and protection, that their experiences didn't define their futures. This work gave purpose to his own suffering and demonstrated that even the most painful experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and compassion. As winter deepened and the Christmas holidays approached, Harry found himself looking forward to the future with genuine excitement for the first time in his life. He was secure in his family relationships, confident in his academic abilities, surrounded by friends who valued him for who he was, and engaged in meaningful work that helped other vulnerable children. "What do you want for Christmas?" McGonagall asked one evening as they sat together in their sitting room, she grading papers and he working on a letter to one of the children he mentored through the support group. It was such a simple question, but it represented everything that had changed in Harry's life. For the first time, an adult was asking what he wanted rather than telling him what he should be grateful for. "I think I have everything I want," Harry said, looking around at their comfortable home, thinking about the friends who cared about him and the meaningful work he was doing. "A family who loves me, work that matters, friends who see me for who I really am. What more could anyone want?" McGonagall smiled, but her expression was thoughtful. "What about for yourself, specifically? Something that would bring you joy just because you enjoy it?" Harry considered this. The idea that he might want things simply for his own pleasure, not because they served some greater purpose or fulfilled someone else's expectations, was still novel enough to require careful thought. "I think I'd like art supplies," he said finally. "I've always been interested in drawing, but I never had proper materials or time to practice. I think I might enjoy creating something beautiful just because I can." "Then art supplies you shall have," McGonagall said with satisfaction. "And perhaps we can arrange for some lessons with the Hogwarts art instructor if you'd like to develop your skills more formally." As Christmas approached, and Harry prepared for his first holiday season as part of a loving family, he reflected on how completely his life had been transformed. 6 months ago, he had been a frightened, isolated child who believed he deserved whatever treatment he received. Now he was a confident young person with a secure family, meaningful friendships, academic success, and a clear sense of purpose in helping other vulnerable children. The transformation hadn't always been easy. Recovery from trauma was complicated and sometimes painful work. But surrounded by people who believed in his worth and supported his healing, Harry had discovered that he was capable of not just surviving, but truly thriving. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged, with people who had chosen to love him, building a future that was entirely his own to determine. It was the greatest gift he could have imagined, and one he intended never to take for granted. Chapter 11. A Different Future. Spring arrived at Hogwarts with the kind of gentle persistence that Harry had learned to associate with genuine positive change, gradual, consistent, and impossible to ignore once it had begun. From his window in McGonagall's quarters, he could see the grounds transforming from winter's stark beauty into the fresh green promise of new growth, and the metaphor wasn't lost on him. He, too, was growing into something new, something that bore little resemblance to the frightened boy who had arrived at the castle 9 months ago. The morning light streamed across his desk where he sat working on an essay for Professor Flitwick about the theoretical applications of protective charm work in institutional settings, a topic that had emerged from his increasing interest in how magic could be used to safeguard vulnerable populations. His handwriting had improved dramatically since the early days of his recovery, partly because his nutrition and general health had stabilized, but mostly because he no longer wrote with the furtive haste of someone who expected to have his work confiscated or criticized at any moment. "Good morning," McGonagall said, entering the sitting room with her usual morning tea and the satisfied expression of someone who had already been awake for hours accomplishing important tasks. "How's the essay coming along?" "Really well," Harry replied, looking up from his parchment with genuine enthusiasm. "I think I've found a way to adapt the protean charm principle to create early warning systems for institutional abuse. If you could charm objects to change when certain trigger conditions are met, signs of malnutrition, unexplained injuries, emotional distress, they could alert oversight authorities before situations escalate to dangerous levels." McGonagall's smile was radiant with the kind of pride that Harry had learned to recognize and treasure. "That's brilliant, Harry. Have you considered submitting your research to the Journal of Applied Magical Ethics? I think the Department of Magical Child Welfare would be very interested in practical applications like this." The idea that his academic work might be worthy of professional publication was still novel enough to make Harry feel a flutter of pride and excitement. At the Dursleys, his intelligence had been seen as threatening and undesirable, something to be discouraged rather than nurtured. Here at Hogwarts, under McGonagall's loving guidance, and with access to professors who genuinely wanted him to succeed, he was discovering that his mind was capable of far more than he had ever imagined. "I'd like to finish a few more sections first," he said thoughtfully. "I want to include some case studies from the support group work I've been doing with the Ministry. With their permission, of course." Harry's work with the Department of Magical Child Welfare had expanded considerably over the months since the trial. What had begun as occasional advisory meetings had evolved into a formal consultancy role that allowed him to contribute his perspective to policy development while still maintaining his focus on education and recovery. He attended weekly task force meetings where his insights as a survivor helped shape new protocols for detection and intervention. More personally meaningful to him, he continued his mentorship work with children who had been removed from abusive situations. "I have a meeting with the task force this afternoon," Harry continued, consulting the schedule McGonagall had helped him develop for managing his various commitments. "We're reviewing the draft guidelines for magical family court procedures. They want to make sure the process is less intimidating for children who have to testify about their experiences." "How do you feel about that responsibility?" McGonagall asked, settling into her chair with her tea and giving him the kind of focused attention that had become one of the most treasured constants of his life. Harry considered the question carefully. The work with abuse survivors was emotionally challenging. It required him to revisit his own trauma regularly and to witness the pain of other children who had suffered similar experiences. But it was also deeply meaningful in ways that made the difficulty worthwhile. "Sometimes it's hard," he admitted. "Listening to other children describe what they've been through, seeing how scared and confused they are. It reminds me of how I felt, and that's not always easy to process." "But," McGonagall prompted gently, hearing the unfinished thought in his voice. "But it's also the most important work I've ever done," Harry said with growing conviction. "When I can help a child understand that the abuse wasn't their fault, or show them that recovery is possible, or just let them know that someone believes them and cares about what happened to them, that matters in a way that nothing else ever has." McGonagall's expression was soft with understanding. "You've found your calling, haven't you?" "I think so," Harry said, and the certainty in his voice surprised even him. "I want to spend my life making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to other children. Not just the obvious abuse, but the institutional failures that allowed it to continue for so long. I want to help build systems that actually protect vulnerable children instead of just paying lip service to their welfare." It was a far cry from the destiny of heroic sacrifice that Dumbledore had envisioned for him, but it felt infinitely more authentic and sustainable. Harry was learning that there were many ways to fight darkness in the world, and that systematic institutional change could be just as powerful as any dramatic confrontation with dark wizards. His academic performance had continued to improve as his health and emotional stability strengthened. Without the constant stress of fear and hunger, with regular therapeutic support and the security of knowing he was loved and valued, Harry's natural intelligence had flourished in ways that impressed even his most demanding professors. "Mr. Potter," Professor Flitwick had said just the week before, reviewing Harry's latest charms assignment, "your theoretical framework for protective magic applications is sophisticated enough for graduate-level study. Have you given any thought to pursuing advanced magical education after Hogwarts?" Harry had, in fact, been thinking quite seriously about his post-Hogwarts plans. The conversation with McGonagall about studying magical law had evolved into detailed research about universities and programs that would prepare him for the kind of institutional reform work he was passionate about pursuing. "I'd like to study at the London Institute of Magical Jurisprudence," he had explained to her over dinner the previous evening. "They have a specialization track in child advocacy law, and their clinical program would let me work with real cases while I'm still studying." "That sounds perfect for your interests," McGonagall had replied, "and your grades certainly qualify you for admission to any program you choose. We should start preparing your applications soon." The idea that his future was a matter of choice rather than predetermined destiny continued to amaze Harry. At the Dursleys, survival had been the only goal, and even that had seemed precarious. Under Dumbledore's manipulation, his future had been entirely planned by someone else's strategic objectives.